Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state, near the abandoned logging town of Holden Village, where the old mining roads disappear into endless corridors of Douglas fir and western hemlock. I should have known something was wrong the moment Marcus suggested we camp at Copper Creek Basin. The way his eyes lingered too long on the topographical map, tracing the dotted lines that marked abandoned trails with his finger. The way he smiled when he mentioned how isolated it would be. But Sarah was excited about getting away from the city, and I was desperate for a break from the divorce proceedings that had been consuming my life for months. Marcus Chen had been Sarah's friend since college. Quiet, methodical, the type who planned everything down to the last detail. Sarah Martinez was my closest friend from work, a nurse who needed this escape as much as I did after losing 2 patients in 1 week. We'd been planning this 3-day hiking trip for months, a chance to disconnect from phones and civilization and reconnect with ourselves. The drive up Forest Service Road 8410 took 4 hours, winding deeper into the North Cascades until the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt, then twin ruts carved between towering trees that blocked out most of the October sky. My Subaru groaned up the final switchbacks, and I found myself checking the fuel gauge more often than necessary. GPS lost signal about 20 miles back, Sarah said, looking at her phone. Good thing Marcus printed those maps. Marcus glanced back from the passenger seat, spreading a USGS topographical map across his lap. We're almost there, another 2 miles to the trailhead. The parking area was nothing more than a widened spot where the road dead-ended, surrounded by trees so thick their trunks disappeared into shadow just yards away. A rusted Forest Service sign hung askew. Copper Creek Trail, unmaintained. Proceed at own risk. Someone had spray-painted "Stay Away" across it in red letters that looked disturbingly fresh. Cheerful, Sarah muttered, shouldering her pack. I hefted my own backpack, feeling the weight of 3 days' worth of food and gear. The silence pressed in around us. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, just the whisper of wind through pine needles high overhead. Even for late October, it felt unnaturally quiet. Marcus consulted his map again, then pointed toward a barely visible gap in the tree line. Trail starts there. It's a 4-mile hike to the basin. The path was little more than a deer track, marked occasionally by faded orange blazes on tree trunks. We walked single file with Marcus leading, me in the middle, and Sarah bringing up the rear. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles that muffled our footsteps, creating an eerie sensation of moving through a sound-dampened world. 2 hours in, I realized I hadn't heard Sarah behind me for several minutes. I stopped and turned around. Sarah? Nothing. The trail stretched empty behind me, vanishing into the green-black shadows between the trees. Marcus, I called ahead. He was already 50 yards further, head down, studying the map. He looked back with irritation. What? Where's Sarah? His expression shifted to confusion, then concern. She was right behind you. We retraced our steps, calling her name. The forest swallowed our voices, returning only silence. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her sitting on a fallen log about 100 yards off the trail, staring into the trees. Sarah, what are you doing? I approached carefully, noting how still she sat, how fixed her gaze was. She blinked slowly and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. I thought I heard something, like singing, from the trees. Marcus frowned. Singing? It was beautiful, Sarah said, standing and brushing pine needles from her pants. Like a child's voice. I followed it. I glanced at Marcus, who was studying Sarah with an expression I couldn't read. "Let's stay together from now on," I said. The trail grew steeper as we climbed, switchbacking up a ridge scarred by old avalanches. Massive deadfall blocked the path in places, forcing us to scramble over moss-slicked logs or push through thickets of young alders. My legs burned, and sweat stung my eyes despite the cool air. "How much further?" Sarah asked. She'd been unusually quiet since her wandering episode, speaking only when spoken to. Marcus checked the map. "Another mile, maybe 2. We should reach the basin before dark." But when we finally emerged from the tree line 3 hours later, Copper Creek Basin was nothing like the pristine alpine meadow the map promised. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 200 yards across, surrounded by towering peaks that blocked out all but a narrow strip of gray sky. The creek itself was little more than a trickle running black between moss-covered rocks. What dominated the space, however, were the trees, dozens of them, scattered throughout the basin like monuments. They were enormous, ancient Douglas firs with trunks easily 10 feet in diameter. But something was wrong with them. They were dead, every single one, their bark hanging in long strips like peeling skin. Their branches stretched upward like skeletal fingers, creating a canopy of death overhead. "This doesn't match the satellite images," Marcus said, consulting his GPS unit, which showed only static. I set down my pack and pulled out my phone. No signal, of course, but the screen flickered strangely, displaying brief flashes of text in a language I didn't recognize before going dark. "Let's make camp over there," Marcus pointed to a flat area near the creek, sheltered by 3 of the dead giants. "We can get water, and there's good drainage." As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation crawled along my spine like ice water, making me glance repeatedly at the tree line. But the forest remained still, revealing nothing. Sarah struggled with her tent, fumbling with poles she'd assembled dozens of times before. Her movements seemed slower, more deliberate, as if she were thinking carefully about each action. "You okay?" I asked, helping her secure a rainfly. She looked at me with those same unfocused eyes from earlier. "I keep hearing that singing," she said quietly. "It's so beautiful, Jennifer, like a lullaby my mother used to sing." Marcus was building a fire ring from stones, working with mechanical precision. "Your mother was Mexican, right, Sarah? What language was the lullaby in?" Sarah paused, her hand stilling on the tent stakes. I don't remember. It's strange. I can hear the melody perfectly, but I can't remember the words." Night fell with unnatural swiftness, as if someone had drawn thick curtains across the basin. Our fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the dead trees that seemed to move independently of the flames. I'd gathered enough firewood to last the night, but the logs burned strangely, producing purple and green flames that hurt to look at directly. "Has anyone else noticed the smell?" Sarah asked, stirring the packet of dehydrated chili she was heating. I sniffed the air. Under the wood smoke was something else, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. It was strongest when the wind shifted toward the tree line. "Probably just decomposing vegetation," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. We ate in relative silence, the crackling fire providing the only sound. When Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, taking a flashlight toward the edge of the basin, Marcus leaned closer to me. "Something's wrong with her," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "She's different. The way she moves, the way she talks, it's like she's delayed somehow, processing everything a split second too slow." I'd noticed it too, but hearing it voiced made it more real, more frightening. "Maybe she's just tired. It was a long hike." Marcus shook his head. "No, this is something else. And did you notice? She hasn't blinked. Not once since we made camp." The observation hit me like a physical blow. He was right. In the hour we'd been sitting around the fire, Sarah's eyes had remained fixed and unblinking, like a snake's. "Sarah?" I called toward the darkness where she disappeared. No response. "Sarah!" Louder this time. Still nothing. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and stood. "I'm going to check on her." "Wait." I caught his arm. "Let's go together." We walked toward the tree line, our lights cutting weak paths through the absolute darkness. The sweet smell grew stronger with each step, almost overwhelming now, like being inside a funeral home. "Sarah," Marcus called. His light caught something pale between the trees. We hurried forward and found Sarah standing perfectly still about 20 yards into the forest, her back to us, staring deeper into the darkness. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I approached slowly, my light illuminating her rigid posture. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge our presence. "Sarah." Marcus reached out and touched her shoulder. She turned around, and in the harsh LED light, I saw something that made my blood freeze. It was Sarah's face, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Her features were too symmetrical, too perfect, as if someone had tried to recreate her from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. Her skin had a waxy quality, and when she smiled, it stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "I was listening to the singing," she said in Sarah's voice, but flatter, emptied of emotion. "It's so beautiful here. We should stay forever." Marcus and I exchanged glances. This wasn't Sarah. Couldn't be Sarah. "Let's go back to camp," I said carefully, as if speaking to a wild animal that might bolt or attack. The thing wearing Sarah's face nodded agreeably and followed us back to the fire. It sat in Sarah's spot and resumed eating Sarah's dinner, but it held the spoon wrong, gripping it in a fist like a child who'd never learned proper etiquette. "I'm tired," Not Sarah announced after finishing the meal. "I think I'll go to sleep now." It stood and walked to Sarah's tent with that same mechanical precision, unzipped the door, and disappeared inside. A moment later, the light from her flashlight went out. Marcus and I sat in stunned silence, the fire crackling between us. "That's not Sarah," I whispered. "I know." His face was pale in the firelight. "Question is, where is the real Sarah?" I glanced toward the tree line, toward the darkness that had swallowed my friend and returned this thing in her place. We need to find her. In the dark? In unfamiliar terrain? Marcus shook his head. "We wait until morning. Stick together. Don't let that thing know we figured it out." The night stretched endlessly. I dozed fitfully in my sleeping bag, jolting awake at every sound: the pop of settling logs in the fire, the whisper of wind through dead branches, the occasional rustle from not Sarah's tent. Marcus took the first watch, then woke me at what his watch claimed was 2 a.m., though it felt like we'd been there for days. During my watch, I heard the singing Sarah had mentioned. It drifted from deep in the forest, wordless and haunting, rising and falling like a lament. The melody was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, and I found myself standing without conscious decision, drawn toward the sound. I managed to catch myself at the edge of the firelight, my feet having carried me halfway to the tree line. The singing stopped immediately, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I forced myself back to the fire and fed it more logs, keeping the flames high until dawn. Morning brought no relief. The sky above the basin remained gray and overcast, and mist clung to the dead trees like cobwebs. Not Sarah emerged from its tent at exactly 7 a.m., moving with that same unnatural precision, and began preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," it said in Sarah's voice. "Did you sleep well?" "Fine," I lied, watching as it cracked eggs into a pan with mechanical efficiency. Everything about its movements was wrong. Too fluid, too practiced, like someone following a script they'd memorized but didn't understand. Marcus packed his gear with quiet urgency. "I think we should head back today," he announced. "Weather's looking rough." The thing wearing Sarah's face looked up at the gray sky and smiled that too wide smile. "Oh, but we just got here. I'd like to explore more." The singing was so beautiful last night. You heard it too? I asked, testing. Of course, didn't you? It was coming from everywhere, like the forest itself was singing. It tilted Sarah's head at an angle that made my skin crawl. I think it wants us to stay. While not Sarah finished cooking, Marcus pulled me aside. We're leaving, he whispered. Now, while it's distracted. We can't leave the real Sarah. If she's even still alive. His eyes were hard. That thing has been wearing her face for 12 hours. What do you think happened to her? The horrible possibility that Sarah was already dead settled in my stomach like a stone, but I couldn't abandon her, not without knowing for certain. I'm going to look for her, I said. In daylight, just a quick search. Absolutely not. We stick together, remember? But I was already moving, grabbing my day pack and water bottle. Give me 2 hours. If I'm not back, leave without me. Jennifer, don't. I ignored his protests and headed for the tree line, following the path of crushed vegetation where something had dragged Sarah, or her body, deeper into the forest. The sweet smell of decay grew stronger as I went, mingling with other odors I couldn't identify. The trail led uphill through increasingly dense forest, past deadfalls and over moss-slicked rocks. After an hour of climbing, I found myself at the edge of another clearing, smaller than the basin but somehow more unsettling. This space was perfectly circular, ringed by the same massive dead trees. But in the center was a structure that made my breath catch, a crude shelter built from branches and mud, shaped like an enormous nest. And hanging from the dead trees all around it were things that had once been human. They dangled from ropes made of twisted sinew, their bodies stretched and elongated, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal agony. Some looked fresh. Others were little more than bones held together by dried tendons. All of them had been opened from sternum to pelvis, their insides carved out with surgical precision. At the base of each tree were smaller forms. Children, dozens of them, also hollowed out, their empty sockets staring accusingly at nothing. And there, tied to the largest tree at the far edge of the clearing, was Sarah. She was still alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn and bloody, and something had carved symbols into her exposed skin, spirals and angles that hurt to look at directly. Her head lolled forward, unconscious or near death. I started toward her, then froze as movement caught my eye. From the nest structure emerged a figure that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs stretched beyond natural proportions, its skin the color of old bones. Where its face should have been was a smooth expanse of flesh broken only by a horizontal gash that served as a mouth, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The thing that had been pretending to be Sarah. It moved with liquid grace, its elongated fingers trailing through the air as it approached the real Sarah. In its hand was a curved knife made from what looked like blackened bone. I realized with sick certainty that I was about to watch my friend die. The creature raised the knife, positioning it just below Sarah's ribcage. Its mouth gash widened in what might have been anticipation. I don't remember deciding to act. One moment I was frozen in terror at the edge of the clearing. The next, I was running, screaming, crashing through the underbrush with my hiking knife in my hand. The creature spun toward me, its faceless head tilting in that same wrong angle I'd seen the night before. It dropped the bone knife and moved to intercept me, covering the distance between us with inhuman speed. We collided hard, rolling across the forest floor in a tangle of limbs. Its skin felt like wet leather, and it smelled of grave earth and rotting flowers. I managed to drive my knife into what I hoped was its chest, feeling the blade punch through skin and muscle before scraping against bone. The thing made a sound like steam escaping from a ruptured pipe and backhanded me with enough force to send me flying into a tree trunk. Stars exploded across my vision. I tasted blood and felt something in my ribs give way with a wet, cracking sound. When my sight cleared, the creature was pulling my knife from its chest, dark fluid that wasn't quite blood oozing from the wound. It advanced on me slowly, savoring my helplessness. Up close, I could see that its elongated fingers ended in yellowed claws, and its skin was covered in the same carved symbols that decorated Sarah's body. Behind it, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She saw me, saw the creature approaching, and something fierce and desperate flickered across her face. With what must have been her last reserves of strength, she began working at the ropes that bound her to the tree. The creature raised my own knife above its head, preparing to drive it down into my chest. I closed my eyes and thought about Marcus, hoping he'd been smart enough to run when I didn't return. The blow never came. I opened my eyes to see Sarah behind the creature, a heavy branch in her hands. She'd broken free and struck it across the back of the head with enough force to splinter the wood. The creature staggered, dark fluid streaming from its skull, and spun to face this new threat. "Run!" Sarah gasped, raising the broken branch like a club. The creature lunged at her. Sarah swung again, connecting with its shoulder and knocking it off balance. It recovered quickly and slashed with its claws, opening 4 parallel gashes across her chest. She stumbled backward, blood soaking her torn shirt. I forced myself to my feet despite the agony in my ribs and grabbed the bone knife the creature had dropped. It was longer than I'd thought, more like a sword, and it felt wrong in my hands. Too warm, too alive. The creature had Sarah backed against a tree, its claws poised to finish what it had started. I drove the bone blade between its shoulder blades with everything I had left. This time, the wound was mortal. The creature arched its back and released a sound like breaking glass. It turned toward me one final time, its mouth gash opening wide enough to reveal a throat that descended far deeper than should have been anatomically possible. Then it collapsed, its elongated limbs folding in on themselves like a closing umbrella. Sarah and I clung to each other in the sudden silence, both of us bleeding, both of us barely able to stand. Around us, the hanging bodies swayed gently in a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the stillness of the clearing. "We have to go," Sarah whispered. "There might be more of them." Getting back to the basin took twice as long as the trip out. We supported each other down the steep slope, stopping frequently to rest and check that nothing was following us. By the time we reached camp, the sun was setting again, painting the dead trees black against an orange sky. Marcus was gone. His tent was still there, but his pack and sleeping bag were missing. A note weighted down with a rock sat beside the cold fire pit. Waited as long as I could. Something wearing Sarah's face came back an hour ago. It's in her tent now. Get out while you can. M. I looked toward Sarah's tent. The zipper was closed, but I could see the faint glow of a flashlight inside, and occasionally the silhouette of a figure moving against the fabric walls. "There's another one," Sarah breathed. "Or maybe the same one. Maybe they don't die easy." We gathered only the essentials: water, first aid supplies, Sarah's car keys, everything else we left behind. As we prepared to flee into the darkness, Sarah's tent began to shake. Not from wind, but from something large moving violently inside. The zipper started to open from within. We ran. The hike out was a nightmare of scrambling through pitch-black forest, guided only by my dying flashlight and the vague memory of the trail. Behind us, something crashed through the underbrush in pursuit, something that howled with voices like breaking steel and moved through the trees with impossible speed. We reached the parking area as my flashlight finally gave out completely. Sarah's Subaru sat where we'd left it, but Marcus's truck was gone. I fumbled for the keys while Sarah kept watch on the tree line. "Hurry," she urged. "I can hear it getting closer." The engine turned over on the second try. I gunned it in reverse, spraying gravel, then spun the wheel and accelerated down the access road without turning on the headlights. Behind us, something tall and wrong emerged from the trees and stood watching our retreat. We drove in silence for the first hour, both of us afraid to speak, afraid that talking about what we'd experienced might somehow call it back to us. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that Sarah finally broke down, sobbing with a mixture of relief and trauma that I felt echoing in my own chest. We spent the rest of the night in a motel in Wenatchee, cleaning our wounds and trying to process what had happened. Sarah's injuries were worse than mine. The claw marks across her chest required 17 stitches, and she'd lost enough blood to need IV fluids at the emergency room. The police were polite but skeptical when we reported Marcus missing. A search and rescue team found our abandoned campsite 3 days later, but no trace of him. The official report listed him as lost in the wilderness, probably fallen into a ravine or taken by a bear. They never found the clearing with the hanging bodies. According to the GPS coordinates I gave them, that location was solid granite cliff face, impassable to hikers. Sarah quit her job at the hospital and moved back to California to live with her sister. We don't talk much anymore, not because we don't want to, but because every conversation inevitably drifts back to those 3 days, and neither of us can handle reliving it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the singing. It comes through my apartment walls in Seattle, wordless and beautiful and terrifying. It calls to me in Sarah's voice, promising peace and rest and an end to the memories that wake me screaming from sleep. I've changed apartments 4 times in the past 2 years, but the singing always finds me, and each time it sounds a little closer, a little more real. Last week, I saw Sarah in the coffee shop across from my office. She was sitting alone at a corner table, staring out the window with that same fixed, unblinking gaze I remembered from our final night in the basin. When I called her name, she turned and smiled that too wide smile, her teeth just a little too sharp. "Hello, Jennifer," she said in Sarah's voice. "The forest misses you. We all miss you." I ran. I'm still running, but I know it's only a matter of time before I stop, before the singing becomes too beautiful to resist, and I find myself walking back into those dead trees to join the others hanging in the darkness. Because the truth is, part of me wants to go back. Part of me has never really left. The forest is calling, and eventually, I know I'll answer. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, near the abandoned logging town of Glenoma, 3 months ago. I should have listened to the locals. When I stopped for supplies at the weathered general store on the outskirts of Packwood, the elderly clerk with liver spots dotting his hands like scattered coins had looked at my topographic map with genuine concern. "You're not thinking of camping up near Devil's Creek, are you?" he'd asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lived in these mountains his entire life. I'd laughed it off. Just a weekend getaway. Need to clear my head after the divorce. The man had studied me for a long moment, taking in my expensive hiking gear and the softness around my middle that spoke of too many desk jobs and not enough outdoor time. That area. Things happen up there. Bad things. Been that way since I was a boy. But I was already committed. The isolation was exactly what I needed. After 18 months of lawyers, custody battles, and sleeping on my brother's couch, I craved the kind of silence you could only find 50 miles from the nearest cell tower. The drive up Forest Service Road 46 took longer than expected. The narrow dirt track twisted through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, their massive trunks creating a cathedral of shadows even in the afternoon sun. My GPS signal had cut out 20 minutes ago, leaving me to navigate by the hand-drawn map the store clerk had reluctantly provided. I found the trailhead just as the sun began its descent toward the Olympic Mountains. The wooden sign was so weathered I could barely make out Devil's Creek Trail, 3.2 miles to camping area. Someone had carved additional words below in fresh letters: "Turn back." The trail wound through old-growth forest, the silence broken only by the distant sound of running water and the occasional crack of settling timber. The trees here were ancient, their bark scarred by decades of lightning and wind. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air held the rich smell of decay and new growth that marked the Pacific Northwest's eternal cycle. I'd planned to make camp before dark, but the trail proved more challenging than anticipated. Fallen logs blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing lengthy detours through dense undergrowth. By the time I reached the clearing marked on my map, twilight had settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. The camping area was little more than a bare patch of earth surrounded by towering trees. A fire ring made of blackened stones sat in the center, filled with cold ashes that looked months old. To the east, Devil's Creek meandered through the darkness, its waters whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Setting up my tent by headlamp, I noticed something odd. The surrounding trees bore strange markings, not the random scratches of bears or the neat cuts of forest management, but deliberate symbols carved deep into the bark. Spirals, intersecting lines, and shapes that hurt to look at directly. In the LED's harsh glare, they seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I'd brought a bottle of whiskey for the occasion, a toast to my newfound freedom, or perhaps a funeral for my failed marriage. Either way, the alcohol helped dull the unease that had been building since I'd passed that defaced trail sign. The fire caught easily despite the damp wood, flames dancing higher than seemed natural for such a small pile of kindling. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere beyond the firelight, barely audible above the creek's murmur. Just my name, spoken so softly, I almost convinced myself it was the wind through the branches. Michael. Long and drawn out like a lover's sigh. I called out, feeling foolish. "Hello, anyone there?" The forest swallowed my voice without echo. Even the night sounds, the rustle of small creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, had fallen silent. Only the creek continued its endless conversation with the stones. I tried to rationalize it. The isolation, the whiskey, the stress of recent months. My mind was playing tricks, creating phantom voices from the white noise of running water. But as I sat there nursing my drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from just beyond the circle of light. The fire burned unusually bright, casting dancing shadows that transformed the carved symbols into writhing serpents. And there it was again, my name, spoken with such intimacy it raised goosebumps along my arms. "Michael, come to us, Michael." This time there was no mistaking it. Multiple voices now, harmonizing in a way that was almost musical. Women's voices, soft and inviting, coming from the darkness beyond the creek. I stood, grabbing my flashlight. The beam penetrated perhaps 20 feet into the forest before being absorbed by the dense undergrowth. Nothing moved in that pale circle of illumination, but I had the distinct impression of retreat, of things melting back into deeper shadows just ahead of the light. "Who's there?" My voice cracked slightly. "This is private property." Laughter answered me, not cruel or mocking, but warm and welcoming, like old friends sharing a private joke. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the trees until I couldn't pinpoint its source. "Join us, Michael. We've been waiting so long." The voices were closer now, just across the creek. I could almost make out shapes in the darkness, pale forms moving between the trees with fluid grace. My rational mind screamed warnings, but something deeper pulled me forward. The sound of my name spoken with such longing, such need. I found myself at the creek's edge before I realized I'd moved. The water was deeper than it looked, black as obsidian and moving with unusual speed. But it was narrow, maybe 6 feet across. I could jump it easily. That's when I saw her. She stood on the far bank, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. A woman in a white dress that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Long dark hair framed a face of such perfect beauty it made my chest ache. When she smiled, showing teeth like pearls in moonlight, I felt my knees weaken. "Michael," she said, and her voice was like silk against my skin. "Come to me. Let me ease your pain." Behind her, more shapes moved in the darkness. Other women, all impossibly beautiful, all wearing that same ethereal white. They swayed slightly as if dancing to music I couldn't hear, their movements hypnotic and inviting. I was at the water's edge now, one foot already extended over the rushing current. The logical part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through law school, that had built a successful practice, that had kept me alive for 34 years, screamed in desperate alarm, but their voices were so sweet, so full of promise. "The pain will stop," the woman continued. "The loneliness, the anger, the fear, all of it will end. Just step across, Michael. Come home." And I almost did. God help me, I was already shifting my weight forward when I caught sight of my reflection in the dark water. For just a moment, the creek's surface was perfectly still, and I saw myself clearly. I looked like hell. Hollow-eyed, unshaven, my face gaunt with months of poor sleep and worse decisions. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was what I saw behind my reflection, shapes moving beneath the water's surface. Not fish, but things with too many teeth and eyes that reflected the starlight like cold gems. The spell broke. Whatever glamour had been clouding my vision shattered like glass, and I stumbled backward from the creek's edge. The beautiful women were still there, but now I could see them clearly. Their white dresses were rotting grave shrouds, their perfect skin mottled with decay. Their beautiful faces, their faces were gone. Smooth expanses of bone gleamed in the flashlight's beam, eye sockets filled with writhing darkness. When they opened their mouths to call my name again, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth and throats that descended into infinite black. I ran. Crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my jacket, I sprinted back toward my campsite. Behind me, their voices rose in a harmony that was no longer seductive, but purely predatory. The sound of pursuit followed, not footsteps, but a wet, sliding noise like massive slugs moving across damp earth. My fire had died to embers while I'd been at the creek, the clearing now lit only by the pale glow of my tent's interior. I dove inside, zipping the entrance shut with shaking hands, as if 2 millimeters of nylon could protect me from whatever those things were. But the voices had stopped. The forest was silent again except for the ever-present murmur of Devil's Creek. I sat in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in white-knuckled hands, waiting for dawn. It came eventually, gray and reluctant. When the first pale light filtered through the tent walls, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. My campsite was destroyed. The fire ring had been scattered, blackened stones thrown about like a child's tantrum. Deep gouges scored the earth around my tent, claw marks or furrows left by something massive dragging itself across the ground. The surrounding trees bore fresh wounds, bark stripped away in long spirals that wept amber sap. But it was the smell that made my stomach heave, sweet corruption, like flowers left too long in a vase mixed with something far worse, the reek of a charnel house. I broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into my pack with no regard for organization. Every shadow seemed to hide movement. Every whisper of wind through the branches sounded like voices calling my name. The carved symbols on the trees were deeper now, as if they'd grown during the night, and the spirals seemed to spin when I wasn't looking directly at them. The hike out felt longer than the journey in. The trail seemed different somehow. Paths I didn't remember, fallen logs in new positions, landmarks that had shifted in subtle but disturbing ways. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The hand-drawn map was useless. The landmarks it showed bore no resemblance to what I saw around me. I was lost. Panic crept up my throat like bile. I'd been hiking for hours, should have reached the trailhead long ago, but the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, an unchanging maze of moss-draped trees and fern-choked undergrowth. The sun was invisible through the canopy, leaving me with no sense of direction or time. That's when I heard the crying, a child's voice sobbing as if her heart was broken. It came from somewhere ahead, muffled by distance and vegetation. Without thinking, I pushed toward the sound. Whatever my problems, I couldn't leave a lost child alone in these woods. I found her in a small clearing, sitting on a moss-covered log with her back to me. Maybe 7 years old, wearing a pink dress that was somehow perfectly clean despite the forest surroundings. Long, blonde hair fell in perfect ringlets down her narrow shoulders. "Hey," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" She turned toward me, and I saw her face was streaked with tears. Perfectly normal tears from perfectly normal blue eyes in a perfectly normal little girl's face, not like those things from the creek. Relief flooded through me. "I can't find my mommy," she said in a voice like crystal bells. "Can you help me find my mommy?" "Of course," I said, approaching slowly with my hands visible. Standard protocol for dealing with lost children. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Emma Morgan. We were camping and I got lost and now I can't find anyone." Morgan. The name was on my list back in the tent, but I pushed that thought aside. Coincidences happened. "Don't worry, Emma, I'm going to help you find your family. Do you remember which direction you came from?" She pointed deeper into the woods, toward an area where the trees grew so thick I could barely see 10 feet. "That way, but I've been walking for hours and everything looks the same." I knew the feeling, but with a child involved, I had to try. "Okay, let's work together. My name is Michael. Can you remember anything about where your campsite was? A creek, maybe, or a big rock?" Emma's face brightened. "Yes, there was water, and Daddy made a fire, and there were pictures carved in the trees." Ice formed in my stomach. "Pictures in the trees?" "Uh-huh. Weird spirals and lines. Mommy said they were really old, from people who lived here before." I stared at the little girl, my mind racing. She was describing my campsite, but that was impossible. I'd been alone all night, and there was only one clearing by Devil's Creek. Unless… "Emma," I said carefully, "when did you get lost? What day is it?" She tilted her head, confused. "Saturday. We just got here yesterday." "Why?" "Yesterday. I'd arrived on Friday, spent the night alone. Unless Emma and her family had been there before me and I'd somehow missed them. But that didn't explain the cold ashes in the fire ring, or the months-old appearance of the campsite." "Show me," I said. "Show me where your family is camping." Emma nodded eagerly and took my hand. Her fingers were ice-cold despite the warming day. She led me through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, along paths I couldn't see but that felt somehow familiar. We walked for what felt like hours, though the light never seemed to change. The trees grew stranger as we went, twisted into impossible shapes, their branches intertwining in patterns that hurt to follow. Moss hung in thick curtains that brushed my face with fingers like wet velvet. And always, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. "Are we close?" I asked during one of our brief rests. "Very close," Emma said, but something in her voice had changed. A flatness that hadn't been there before. When I looked at her more closely, I noticed other changes too. Her perfect ringlets had lost their bounce, hanging limp and lifeless. Her pink dress, while still clean, seemed faded somehow. And her eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Emma," I said slowly, "are you feeling all right?" She turned to look at me fully, and I saw that her pupils had become elongated, like a cat's. When she smiled, her teeth seemed sharper than they had been moments before. "I'm fine, Michael," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that raised every hair on my body. "We're almost to Mommy and Daddy." I should have run then. Every instinct screamed at me to drop her hand and sprint back the way we'd come. But children don't just transform into monsters in broad daylight. I was suffering from exposure, dehydration, maybe the early stages of hypothermia. My mind was creating threats where none existed, wasn't it? "There," Emma said, pointing ahead. "Do you see the smoke?" I did see it, a thin gray column rising above the tree line. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees nearly buckled. People meant safety, rescue, a way out of this nightmare forest. Even if Emma's family couldn't help me directly, they'd have supplies, maybe a satellite phone or GPS unit. But as we drew closer, my relief curdled into something else. The campsite Emma led me to was mine. The scattered stone fire ring, the gouged earth, the carved trees, everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. Except now there was a family there. A man tended a small fire while a woman in a faded yellow jacket sat on a fallen log, staring into the flames. Neither looked up as Emma and I approached, though we made no effort to be quiet. They sat perfectly still, unnaturally so, like mannequins posed in a tableau of camping life. "Mommy, Daddy," Emma called, releasing my hand and running toward them. "I found a nice man to help us." The woman turned toward Emma's voice, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She'd been beautiful once, probably recently, but something had happened to her features. They were slack, unfocused, as if she was sleepwalking. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her skin had a waxy, unhealthy pallor. "Emma," she said in a voice like rustling leaves, "you came back." The man by the fire turned as well, and he was in even worse condition. Deep scratches marked his face and arms, some still weeping blood. His clothes were torn and filthy, and when he smiled at Emma, I saw that several of his teeth were missing. "We missed you, sweetheart," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Come give Daddy a hug." Emma ran to him, and he lifted her with arms that shook with effort. Over her shoulder, his eyes met mine, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. No recognition, no awareness. Just hunger. Deep, endless hunger. "Emma," I said carefully, "I think we should go. Let your parents rest." But Emma wasn't listening. She whispered something in her father's ear, and his death-hungry gaze fixed on me with sudden intensity. "Michael," he said, and hearing my name from those lips was like being touched by ice. "Emma tells me you're lost." "Just turned around," I said, backing slowly away from the fire. "I'm sure I can find my way out." "But why leave so soon?" the woman asked, rising to her feet with movements that seemed jointless, boneless. "We're so lonely up here, so hungry for company." I turned to run, but Emma was suddenly there, blocking my path. Impossible. She'd been 20 feet away with her father just seconds before, but there she was, no longer crying, no longer afraid. When she smiled, her teeth were needle-sharp and her eyes were completely black. "Don't go, Michael," she said in a voice like breaking glass. "We want to play." Behind me, I heard the parents moving, their footsteps wet and sliding like the sounds I'd heard at the creek. I spun around looking for an escape route, but they were everywhere now, surrounding me, closing in with jerky, unnatural movements. The father's face was changing, skin stretching and shifting as if something else was trying to push through from beneath. The mother's fingers had grown into claws, dark blood caked under the nails. And Emma wasn't a little girl anymore. What stood before me was something wearing a child's shape like an ill-fitting costume, all wrong proportions and movements that bent in directions human joints shouldn't allow. "What do you want?" I gasped, pulling out my hunting knife with shaking hands. "To feed," the thing that wasn't Emma said. "To grow strong. You're so full of pain, Michael, so full of loneliness and despair. We'll take it all away." They moved as one, the family that had never been a family, their bodies flowing like liquid shadow. I slashed wildly with the knife, feeling it connect with something that gave way like rotten fruit. Black ichor splashed across my hand, burning like acid. The not Emma shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and stumbled backward. The others hesitated for just a moment, and I seized the chance. Sprinting past them into the forest, I heard their pursuit immediately. Not footsteps, but a horrible slithering, as if enormous snakes were chasing me through the undergrowth. I ran without direction, without plan, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, the family's voices rose in that same haunting harmony I'd heard at the creek, calling my name, promising peace, promising an end to pain. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I was on a road. Not the Forest Service track I'd taken in, but real asphalt with yellow lines down the center. A highway. Salvation. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a sheriff's deputy patrol car that stopped with a squeal of brakes. The deputy who got out was a young woman with concerned eyes and a hand resting on her weapon. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've been through hell." I tried to explain, tried to tell her about the things in the forest, but the words came out as incoherent babbling. She called for an ambulance and backup, then wrapped me in a blanket from her trunk while we waited. "Devil's Creek," I finally managed to say. "There are things up there, dangerous things." The deputy's expression changed. "Devil's Creek? Sir, that area's been closed to camping for over 20 years, ever since the Morgan family disappeared." Morgan. Emma Morgan. "What happened to them?" I whispered. "They went up there for a weekend camping trip. Father, mother, and a 7-year-old daughter named Emma. Search and rescue found their campsite torn apart, but no bodies. No trace of what happened to them." She studied my face carefully. "Sir, how did you know to mention Devil's Creek?" I couldn't answer. Couldn't tell her about the family that had tried to feed on my despair, about the little girl who'd been lost for 20 years but still remembered her name. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to forget the sound of Emma calling my name as the ambulance sirens grew louder. The doctors said I was suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. The scratches on my face and arms were consistent with pushing through dense undergrowth. The burns on my hand were harder to explain. They found traces of an unknown organic compound that ate through skin like acid. They kept me for observation for 3 days. On the second night, I woke to the sound of a child singing in the hallway outside my room. A lullaby I didn't recognize. Sweet and sad and infinitely lonely. When I pressed the call button, the nurse who responded said she hadn't heard anything. But I knew that voice. I was released on a Thursday. By Friday, I'd sold everything I owned and moved to Phoenix, as far from the forests of Washington as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I told everyone it was for the weather, for a fresh start after the divorce. I didn't tell anyone about the dreams. Every night I dream of Devil's Creek. I see Emma standing at the water's edge, still wearing her pink dress, still crying for her mommy. Sometimes her parents are with her, forever trapped in their twisted tableau of family camping. They call to me across the dark water, promising peace, promising an end to loneliness. And sometimes in the deepest part of night when sleep is thin and full of whispers, I'm tempted to go back, to find that trailhead again and walk into the forest of forever, to join the family that's been waiting 20 years for someone new to love. But I don't. I won't. Because I remember the hunger in their eyes, and I know what kind of love they offer. The kind that consumes everything and leaves nothing behind but whispers in the dark and carved symbols on trees that bleed amber tears. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. I survived Devil's Creek, but I'm not the same man who walked into those woods 3 months ago. Something followed me home. Not the family, but the knowledge of what waits in the deep places of the world. Some nights, when the desert wind howls around my apartment building, I hear voices in the sound. Children laughing, women singing lullabies, men calling names across vast distances. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my own voice answering back. That's when I know they're still waiting. They're always waiting. My name is Brandon Edwards, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Chugach Mountains in Alaska, about 40 miles northeast of Anchorage, in an area locals call the Devil's Backbone, a jagged ridge of black stone that cuts through the forest like a massive spine. I should have listened to the old man at the supply store in Eagle River. His weathered face had gone pale when Timothy and I showed him our planned route on the topographical map, our fingers tracing the thin lines that marked barely their trails winding deep into the Chugach backcountry. "You boys don't want to go there," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not this time of year, not when the snow comes early and the darkness stretches long." His gnarled finger had tapped the map where we'd marked our planned campsite. Bad things happen in them woods. Always have. But Timothy Hill, my best friend since college, had just laughed it off. "Come on, old-timer. It's just wilderness. We've been planning this hunting trip for months." Tim was like that, fearless to a fault, the kind of guy who'd run toward danger while everyone else ran away. That's what made him such a good emergency room doctor, and such a terrible listener when it came to warnings. I wish to God I'd been more like that old man. I wish I'd trusted the ice-cold dread that had settled in my stomach the moment we'd driven past the last cell tower, watching our phones lose signal as the road turned from asphalt to gravel to nothing but tire ruts carved through dying grass. The first sign that something was wrong came on our second day, October 15th, deep in the Chugach wilderness. We'd hiked 12 miles from the trailhead, our packs heavy with a week's worth of supplies, following a game trail that seemed to shift and wander more than any path should. The GPS had been acting strange since morning, showing our location jumping erratically, sometimes placing us miles from where we actually stood. "Technology," Tim had muttered, shaking his device like that would fix the satellites. "Give me a paper map any day." But when we pulled out the topographical maps, they didn't make sense either. The trail we'd been following for hours simply wasn't marked. The landmarks we'd been using, a distinctive split boulder, a lightning-struck pine, appeared to be in completely different locations than where they should have been. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I'd suggested, though I knew we hadn't. I'd been checking the compass religiously, and we'd been heading steadily northeast the entire time. Tim had just shrugged. "We'll figure it out. Worst case, we follow the creek bed back down to the main trail." He'd pointed to a narrow stream that wound through the valley below us, its water running so dark it looked almost black against the yellowing aspen leaves. That night, we'd made camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees. The forest felt different here, older somehow, heavier. The trees grew so thick that even in daylight the spaces between them remained shrouded in deep shadow. When evening came, the darkness seemed to press in from all sides like a living thing. Our campfire struggled to stay lit despite the dry wood Tim had gathered. The flames kept guttering and sparking, throwing wild shadows that made the trees look like they were moving, reaching toward us with gnarled branch fingers. Twice I had to rebuild it completely when it went out for no reason at all. "Weird draft in this valley," Tim had said, but I could tell he was unsettled too. He kept glancing over his shoulder at the tree line, his hand unconsciously moving to the bear spray clipped to his belt. That's when we heard the sounds. It started as a low humming, almost musical, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal, something in between that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. The sound would fade to nothing, then swell again, always seeming to come from a different direction. "Wolves?" I'd asked, though I knew it wasn't. I'd heard wolves before, during hunting trips in Montana and Wyoming. This was something else entirely. Tim had been quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond our flickering firelight. "Yeah," he'd finally said. "Probably wolves." But neither of us slept well that night. I'd dozed fitfully in my sleeping bag, jerking awake every time a branch cracked in the darkness or the wind shifted through the trees. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I'd been awakened by what sounded like footsteps circling our camp, slow, deliberate, staying just outside the ring of dying firelight. When I'd whispered Tim's name, he'd whispered back immediately, as if he'd been lying awake listening too. "You hear that?" "Yeah." We'd lain there in tense silence, hands on our hunting knives until dawn finally began to filter through the canopy above us. Morning brought no relief. When I'd unzipped my sleeping bag, I'd found my boots filled with what looked like grave dirt, black, loamy soil that stank of decay and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of the morgue where I'd done my residency rotations before I'd switched to family practice because I couldn't handle the smell of death every day. Tim's boots had been missing entirely. "I put them right here," he'd said, standing in his sock feet next to his sleeping bag. "Right fucking here." He'd searched the entire campsite twice, growing more agitated each time he came up empty. We'd finally found them hanging from a branch 15 feet above our heads, tied together by their laces and dangling like some grotesque Christmas ornament. Neither of us could reach them, even standing on each other's shoulders. "Kids," Tim had said, though we both knew there was no way kids could have made it this far into the wilderness. Fucking kids playing pranks. But his voice had been shaking, and I'd seen the way his hands trembled as he'd pulled on his backup hiking boots. The third day was when Tim went to gather firewood and came back wrong. He'd left camp around 4 in the afternoon, axe in hand, grumbling about how the wood we'd collected the night before had somehow become damp and useless overnight. "I'll be back in an hour," he'd called over his shoulder as he disappeared into the tree line. "Try not to let anything eat you while I'm gone." But an hour had passed, then 2. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of old blood, I'd been ready to go looking for him. I'd been standing at the edge of our camp, shouting his name into the gathering darkness when I'd heard his voice calling back from the forest. "I'm coming. Found some good deadfall about a quarter-mile east. Give me 10 minutes." His voice had sounded off. Too loud, too cheerful, like someone doing a bad impression of my best friend. But it was definitely Tim's voice. So I'd waited. When he'd finally emerged from the tree line, he'd been empty-handed. "Where's the wood?" I'd asked. Tim had stared at me for a long moment, his face blank. "What wood?" "The firewood. You went to get firewood." Another pause. Then that too bright smile had spread across his face. "Oh, right. Firewood. I couldn't find any good pieces. All rotten." He'd sat down heavily next to the fire pit, still smiling that wrong smile. "We'll make do with what we have." But we didn't have anything. The wood pile next to our fire ring was completely empty, though I could have sworn it had been stocked when Tim left. I'd stared at my best friend, really stared, trying to figure out what was different about him. His clothes were the same, his face was the same, even the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident was exactly where it should be. But something fundamental had changed. His eyes, I'd realized. Tim's eyes had always been a warm brown, full of laughter and mischief. These eyes were black. Not just the pupils, the entire visible part of each eye was the color of obsidian, reflecting the firelight like polished stone. "Tim," I'd said carefully, "are you feeling okay?" "Never better." That same terrible smile. "Why do you ask, Brandon?" The way he'd said my name had made my skin crawl. Too precise, like he was reading it off a card, like he'd had to think about what to call me. I'd spent that night awake, sitting with my back against a tree, clutching my hunting knife while Tim slept, or pretended to sleep, across the dying embers of our fire. Every few minutes I'd catch him watching me through slitted eyelids, those black eyes glittering in the darkness. By morning, I'd made my decision. Whatever had happened to my friend, whatever had come back wearing his face, I needed to get away from it. The problem was I was 40 miles from the nearest road, in terrain I didn't recognize, with equipment that no longer worked properly. "I think we should head back," I'd said over a breakfast of granola bars and lukewarm coffee from our camp stove. "This place gives me the creeps." Tim had nodded enthusiastically. "Great idea. I know a shortcut." That should have been my second warning. Tim had never been here before. How could he know a shortcut? But I'd been so desperate to leave that I'd chosen to ignore the impossibility of it. We'd broken camp and started hiking west, following a deer trail that Tim claimed would take us back to the main path in half the time. But after 2 hours of walking, the trail had simply vanished. One moment, we'd been following a clear path through the underbrush. The next, we'd been standing in the middle of dense forest with no trail in sight. "Where did it go?" I'd asked, spinning in a slow circle trying to spot any sign of the path we'd been following. Tim had been standing perfectly still, his back to me, staring deeper into the forest. "This way," he'd said, and started walking. "Tim, wait. The trail was this way." His voice had been different again. Flatter, more certain, like he was being directed by something I couldn't see. I'd followed him because I'd had no choice. The alternative was being alone in this nightmare wilderness, and despite everything, some part of me still hoped that my friend was in there somewhere, that whatever was wrong with him could be fixed. For 3 hours, we'd climbed steadily uphill through forest that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with every step. The trees here were massive, old-growth spruce and hemlock that blocked out most of the sky. Between their trunks, the shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind above. That's when I'd started hearing the humming again. It was the same sound from our first night, but louder now, and definitely coming from ahead of us. Tim seemed drawn to it, walking faster and faster despite the rough terrain. I'd had to jog to keep up with him, my pack bouncing painfully against my spine. "Tim, slow down. Where are we going?" He'd stopped so suddenly that I'd almost collided with his back. When he'd turned around, his black eyes had been completely expressionless. "We're here," he'd said. We'd been standing at the edge of a clearing I'd never seen before, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by those massive trees. The ground was covered with what looked like animal bones, bleached white and scattered in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the clearing stood a single dead tree, its branches twisted into shapes that suggested reaching hands and screaming faces. And hanging from those branches were backpacks, dozens of them. Some new, some so weathered they were falling apart, all different colors and brands, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The humming was coming from the tree. "Tim," I'd whispered, backing toward the tree line, "we need to leave. Now." But when I turned around, Tim was gone. I'd spun in a complete circle, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest was silent except for that awful humming. No footsteps, no rustling bushes, no sign that another human being had ever been there. "Tim!" I'd screamed, my voice echoing strangely in the clearing. "Tim, where are you?" That's when I'd heard the laughter. It had started low and soft, almost like the wind, but there was no mistaking the intelligence behind it. Something was laughing at me. Something was enjoying my terror. The laughter had seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees, from the ground beneath my feet, from inside my own head, and underneath it I'd heard a new sound. Chewing. Wet, rhythmic chewing, like someone eating something that was still alive. I'd run. I'd crashed through the forest like a madman, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my pack bouncing and swaying as I'd fought my way through underbrush that seemed to reach for me with thorny fingers. Behind me, the laughter had followed, growing louder and more delighted with every stumbling step I'd taken. I'd run until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing against the base of a massive spruce tree somewhere deep in the forest. When I'd finally caught my breath enough to listen, the laughter had stopped. The forest around me had been completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of my own breathing seemed to penetrate the oppressive quiet. That's when I'd noticed the smell. It had been faint at first, like meat left too long in the sun. But as I'd sat there gasping, it had grown stronger. Sweet and cloying and absolutely stomach-turning. The smell of decay, of infection, of something that should have been buried long ago, and it had been coming from right behind me. I turned around slowly, knowing I didn't want to see what was there but unable to stop myself. The base of the tree I'd been leaning against had been hollow, carved out into a rough cave-like opening. And inside that hollow space, something had been moving. It had been Tim, sort of. His body had still been recognizably human, but stretched wrong, elongated like taffy. His arms had been too long, his fingers extended into claws that scraped against the bark as he'd moved. His face had been the worst part. Still Tim's features, but pulled and distorted. His jaw unhinged like a snake's to accommodate rows of yellowed teeth that were definitely not human. and his eyes had still been black, but now they'd reflected light like an animal's, glowing with a hunger that had been absolutely inhuman. "Brandon," he'd said, his voice a wet whisper that had seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I've been waiting for you." The thing that had been Tim had begun to unfold itself from the hollow tree, moving with joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. As it had emerged, I'd seen that its skin had been mottled gray and black, like frostbite, and covered with patches of coarse hair that had looked more like animal fur. I'd known what it was then. The old stories my grandfather had told me around campfires when I was a kid. Stories about cannibals who'd eaten human flesh until they'd become something else, something hungry and wrong and eternally starving. The Algonquian tribes had called them Wendigo. The Wendigo that had been my best friend had smiled at me with too many teeth. "I'm so hungry, Brandon, so very hungry, and you smell delicious." I'd scrambled backward, my hand scrabbling for the hunting knife on my belt. The blade had seemed pathetically small against the creature that had begun to advance on me, moving with a predatory grace that had made my skin crawl. "Tim, I know you're in there somewhere. Fight it. This isn't you." The Wendigo had tilted its head, the motion eerily reminiscent of my friend's old habit of cocking his head when he was thinking. For just a moment, something had flickered in those black eyes, something human and terrified and screaming. "Help me," it had whispered in Tim's voice. "Please, Brandon. It hurts so much. I can't stop thinking about how you'll taste." Then the human expression had vanished, replaced by that awful predatory hunger. It had lunged. I'd rolled sideways, slashing wildly with my knife. The blade had caught it across the ribs, opening a gash that had leaked something black and foul-smelling instead of blood. The Wendigo had shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a woman screaming, and had stumbled backward. But it had barely seemed to notice the wound. Within seconds, the gash had begun to close, the gray skin knitting itself back together like it was being sewn by invisible hands. I'd run again. This time, I'd had a destination, the creek Tim and I had planned to follow back to civilization. If I could find the water, I could follow it downstream until it met larger tributaries, then larger streams, then eventually the main river that would lead me back to the highway. But the forest had seemed determined to prevent my escape. Paths that had looked clear from a distance had turned out to be blocked by fallen logs or impenetrable thickets. Game trails had led me in circles, bringing me back to the same landmarks over and over again. My compass had spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. And behind me, always behind me, I'd heard the Wendigo following. Sometimes it had sounded far away, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded bear. Sometimes it had seemed close enough to touch, breathing down my neck with breath that had smelled like rotting meat. The worst part had been when it had started talking to me. "Brandon." Tim's voice echoing through the trees. "Brandon, wait up. I want to show you something." I'd kept running. "Remember that time in college when you got food poisoning? I took care of you for 3 days. Didn't I take care of you?" The voice had been closer that time, close enough that I'd been able to hear the wet, clicking sounds its throat had made between words. "I'm still your friend, Brandon. I just want to take care of you now. It won't hurt for long." I'd pressed my hands over my ears and had run faster. By the time full darkness had fallen, I'd been completely lost. The forest around me had been so black that I'd barely been able to see my own hands, let alone find any kind of path. Every shadow could have hidden the Wendigo. Every sound could have been it creeping closer. I'd finally stopped running when I literally couldn't see where I was going anymore. I'd found what had felt like a small depression in the ground, possibly an old bear den, and had crawled inside, pulling my pack in after me and trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. That's where I'd spent the longest night of my life. For hours, I'd listened to the Wendigo hunting for me. It had called my name in Tim's voice, then in my mother's voice, then in voices I didn't recognize. It had scratched at trees, leaving long gouges in the bark that had sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. It had laughed that awful, bubbling laugh, the sound echoing through the forest like a broken music box. Sometime around midnight, it had found my hiding spot. Brandon. The voice had been right outside my tiny shelter, so close I'd been able to feel its breath through the opening. "I can smell you in there, Al. You smell scared. Fear makes the meat taste better." I'd held my knife in front of me and had tried not to breathe. "I know you're awake. I can hear your heart beating. Thump, 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 like a little rabbit." Something had scraped against the entrance to my hiding spot. Claws, testing the opening to see if it could fit through. "Come out, Brandon. Let's get this over with. I promise I'll make it quick. Well, mostly quick." I'd closed my eyes and had prayed to a God I'd stopped believing in years ago. The scraping had stopped. For a long moment, there had been complete silence. Then, the Wendigo had started digging. I'd felt dirt and leaves raining down on me as those terrible claws had attacked the earth above my hiding spot. The depression had begun to collapse, filling with debris and loose soil. In another few minutes, I'd either be crushed or exposed. That's when I'd remembered the emergency flare in my pack. My fingers had fumbled through the contents of my backpack, searching desperately while dirt had continued to rain down on me. Sleeping bag, water bottles, first aid kit. There, the small cylindrical tube that had been part of my emergency kit. I'd pulled the cap off the flare and had struck the igniter. The brilliant red light had turned my tiny shelter into a hellscape of crimson shadows. But more importantly, it had apparently surprised the Wendigo. The digging had stopped, and I'd heard something large scrambling backward through the underbrush. I'd crawled out of my collapsing hiding spot, holding the flare above my head like a torch. The red light had illuminated a rough circle of forest around me, and at the very edge of that circle, I'd seen the Wendigo. It had been crouched on all fours like an animal, its elongated body coiled and ready to spring. But it hadn't approached the light. Instead, it had stayed at the very edge of the flare's illumination, pacing back and forth like a caged wolf. "Clever," it had said in Tim's voice, "but that won't last forever." It had been right. Flares burned for maybe 15 minutes under ideal conditions. In the cold mountain air, I'd probably had 10 minutes at most. But 10 minutes had been enough to realize that the light was keeping it at bay. The Wendigo might be nearly indestructible, but it was a creature of darkness and shadow. Bright light seemed to hurt it, or at least make it cautious. I'd started walking, holding the flare in front of me like a shield. The Wendigo had followed, staying just outside the circle of light, but it hadn't attacked. Every few minutes it had tried to circle around behind me, but whenever it had gotten too close, I'd held the flare toward it and it had retreated. "You can't walk forever," it had called. "And when that light goes out, I'll be waiting." The flare had burned down to my fingers before I'd found salvation. A small stream, barely 3 feet wide, running over smooth stones between its banks. According to every folk tale I'd ever heard, evil spirits couldn't cross running water. I'd waded into the middle of the stream just as the flare had guttered out, plunging the forest back into absolute darkness. For a moment, there had been silence. Then I'd heard the Wendigo approaching through the trees, its claws clicking against bark and stone. "Come on out, Brandon. The water won't save you. I used to be human, remember? I can cross running water just fine." But when it had reached the edge of the stream, it had stopped. "Come here," it had said, and for the first time, there had been uncertainty in its voice. "No." I'd heard it pace back and forth along the bank, growing more agitated by the minute. It had tried wading into the stream several times, but each time it had hissed and had retreated, like the water had been burning it. "Please," it had said finally, and for a moment it had sounded like Tim again. "Please, I'm so hungry. It hurts so much. Tim, I know you're in there. You need to fight this thing. I can't. It's too strong. But if you feed it, maybe it will let me rest." The humanity in its voice had been heartbreaking, but I'd stayed in the middle of the stream. As dawn had finally begun to break through the canopy above, the Wendigo had let out one final shriek of frustration and had melted back into the forest shadows. I'd waited another hour before I dared to leave the stream, but it had seemed to be gone. Following the water downstream had taken me most of the day, but eventually the small creek had joined a larger tributary, then a proper river. By late afternoon, I'd seen the first sign of civilization, a ranger's cabin, empty but equipped with a radio. The search and rescue team had found me 12 hours later, half frozen and completely incoherent. They'd mounted a search for Tim that had lasted 3 weeks, but they'd never found so much as a scrap of clothing. The official report had listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. I'd never told them about the Wendigo. Who would have believed me? But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my apartment in Anchorage, I hear something calling my name. It sounds like Tim's voice, but wrong somehow. Hungry. And I know that somewhere in the Chugach Mountains, something that used to be my best friend is still waiting in the darkness. Still hungry, still searching for the meal that got away. I've never gone camping again. The old man at the supply store was right. Bad things happen in those woods. Always have, and they always will. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Bridger-Teton National Forest, Wyoming, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my best friend Derek. I should have known something was wrong the moment we passed the rusted sign marking the Gros Ventre Wilderness boundary. The metal was pocked with bullet holes, and someone had scratched deep gouges through the Park Service information, as if trying to claw the words away entirely. Derek laughed it off, said it was probably just locals having fun with target practice, but I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the October chill. Derek Morrison had been my closest friend since college. We'd roomed together for 2 years, survived organic chemistry and a particularly brutal statistics professor, and somehow managed to stay in touch even after graduation scattered us across different cities. He was the kind of guy who made friends effortlessly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and the kind of natural confidence that drew people in. I was quieter, more cautious, the one who read the fine print and checked the weather forecast twice. We balanced each other out. The camping trip had been Derek's idea, of course. He'd called me 3 weeks earlier, voice crackling through a bad cell connection from his new job in Denver. "Mike, you sound like you're dying of boredom," he'd said, and he wasn't wrong. My accounting job in Minneapolis had been slowly suffocating me with its endless parade of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. "Remember that place we talked about hiking after graduation? The one with all those crazy stories?" I remembered. We'd read about the Gros Ventre Wilderness in some outdoors magazine, drawn by the promise of untouched backcountry and the kind of solitude you couldn't find in the more popular parks. The article had mentioned local folklore, stories about hunters who went missing for days only to stumble out of the forest with no memory of where they'd been, tales of voices calling from deep in the woods that sounded exactly like loved ones in distress. Standard wilderness mythology, we'd figured. Every remote place had its ghost stories. "The trailhead's only about 40 minutes from Jackson," Derek had continued. "I've got vacation time saved up, and you mentioned your boss was pushing everyone to take their PTO before year-end. Come on, man. When's the last time we did something that wasn't sitting in a bar talking about how much we hate our jobs?" So here we were, Derek's beat-up Subaru crunching over the gravel road that led to the Sheep Creek trailhead. The afternoon sun slanted through the aspens, their leaves already turned the brilliant gold of late autumn. But there was something unsettling about the quality of light. It seemed to bend wrong around the trees, creating shadows that were too deep and angles that didn't quite make sense. "Jesus, it's quiet out here," Derek said as we pulled into the empty parking area. He was right. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no distant hum of traffic, just the tick of his cooling engine and the whisper of wind through dying leaves. We shouldered our packs, mine meticulously organized and color-coded, Derek's stuffed with the casual confidence of someone who'd never forgotten essential gear, and headed for the trailhead. The path was well maintained for the first mile, winding through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from between the trees. "You're being paranoid," I told myself, but my hand kept drifting to the bear spray clipped to my belt. Derek was in his element, pointing out landmarks and sharing half-remembered facts about local geology. "See how the rock layers are all twisted up there? That's from when the Tetons were forming. Crazy to think this was all underwater once." I tried to focus on his voice, on the familiar comfort of his enthusiasm, but the silence between his words felt oppressive. It was like walking through a library where all the books had been removed, leaving only empty shelves and the echo of forgotten knowledge. We'd planned to hike about 6 miles to a backcountry campsite Derek had found on some obscure hiking forum. "Totally off the beaten path," he'd assured me. "The guy who posted about it said he'd never seen another soul out there." By the time we reached the turnoff for our destination, the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of dried blood. The side trail was barely visible, marked only by a small cairn that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. "You sure this is right?" I asked, consulting the GPS on my phone. The screen flickered, showing our location as a blank space between map tiles. "Relax, Mike. When have I ever led you astray?" Derek grinned, but there was something forced about it, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees pressed closer with each step, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the dying daylight barely penetrated. I found myself walking closer to Derek, drawn by some primitive need for companionship in the gathering darkness. "There," Derek said, pointing ahead to where the trees opened into a small clearing. "Perfect." The campsite was everything we'd hoped for. A level patch of ground beside a small creek surrounded by towering pines that would provide shelter from the wind. But as we dropped our packs and began setting up camp, I noticed things that didn't sit right. The fire ring in the center of the clearing was filled with ashes that looked far too old for the remote location, as if no one had camped here in years. Yet the stones were arranged with careful precision, forming a perfect circle that seemed almost ritualistic. "Weird," Derek muttered, kicking at the ashes. "These look ancient, but check this out." He held up a fragment of aluminum foil, still bright and unweathered. "Someone was here recently." I examined the foil and my skin prickled. It was torn in a strange pattern, with jagged edges that formed shapes that reminded me of claw marks. "Maybe we should find another spot," I suggested. "Come on, don't be a baby. It's just litter." But Derek's voice lacked its usual conviction. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing, close enough for conversation but far enough apart to avoid the claustrophobic feeling of sleeping on top of each other. As I drove the last stake into the hard-packed earth, I heard something that made me freeze. Laughter, distant and echoing, but unmistakably human, and familiar. "Derek, did you hear that?" He looked up from where he was arranging kindling in the fire ring. "Hear what?" "Laughter. It sounded like—" I trailed off, realizing how crazy it would sound. It had sounded like my ex-girlfriend Sarah, whom I hadn't seen in over a year. Just the wind, probably. These mountains play tricks with sound. I wanted to believe him, but the laughter came again, closer this time. Definitely female, definitely familiar, carrying a note of invitation that made my chest tight with longing. Without thinking, I took a step toward the tree line. "Whoa there, Romeo." Derek's hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Where are you going?" I blinked, surprised to find myself at the edge of the clearing. I thought I heard something. "Yeah, you mentioned that. Sit down. Help me get this fire going before it gets full dark." The flames caught just as the last light faded from the sky, creating a bubble of orange warmth in the vast darkness. We cooked a simple dinner of freeze-dried camping food, and shared a bottle of whiskey Derek had smuggled in his pack. For a while, it felt like old times, just two friends enjoying each other's company in the wilderness. But as the night deepened, the wrongness crept back in. The fire, which should have been crackling cheerfully, burned with an odd blue-green tinge around the edges. Our voices seemed muffled, as if the darkness itself was absorbing sound, and the silence beyond our small circle of light was so complete it felt alive, pressing against us like a physical presence. "You ever wonder what's really out there?" Derek asked, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey. He was staring into the forest with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we like to think we've got everything figured out. GPS, satellite phones, rescue beacons, but there's still so much wilderness left, so many places where nobody ever goes. What if there are things out there that don't want to be found?" I laughed nervously. "You've been reading too many cryptid blogs." "Maybe." He took another swig from the bottle. "But my grandfather used to tell stories about this area. He worked for the Forest Service back in the 60s, before they opened it up to the public. Said there were parts of these mountains that the old-timers just avoided. Places where hunters would go in and never come out, or come out. Different." "Different how?" Derek's eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Hungry. Always hungry, no matter how much they ate. And cold, even in summer, like something had gotten inside them and eaten everything warm." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, loud as a gunshot in the oppressive silence. We both froze, listening, but heard nothing else. "Probably just a deer," I said, but my voice came out as a whisper. "Probably," Derek agreed, but he was reaching for the hunting knife on his belt. We sat in tense silence for another hour, jumping at every sound, until exhaustion finally won out over paranoia. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, suddenly feeling like a child hiding under the covers. Through the thin nylon walls, I could hear Derek moving around the campsite, checking and rechecking our food storage, making sure the fire was banked properly. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of something massive moving through the forest just beyond the edge of vision. In my dreams, the thing had Derek's voice, calling my name with increasing urgency, begging me to come find him. Each time I jolted awake, heart hammering, expecting to hear him screaming for real. But there was only silence. I woke to pale dawn light filtering through my tent walls and the sound of Derek moving around outside. "Morning, sunshine," he called when he heard me stirring. "Coffee's ready." I emerged from my tent to find him crouched beside a revived fire, looking haggard but determinedly cheerful. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his movements had a jittery quality that suggested he'd slept even less than I had. "How'd you sleep?" I asked, accepting a steaming mug of camp coffee. "Like a baby," he lied. "You?" "Great," I lied back. We broke camp with unusual efficiency, both of us eager to be moving. The original plan had been to spend 2 more nights at the site, exploring the surrounding area during the day, but neither of us mentioned this as we packed our gear with unseemly haste. "Maybe we should head back to the car," I suggested as casually as I could. "Weather's supposed to turn this afternoon." Derek paused in stuffing his sleeping bag. "Actually, I was thinking the same thing. This place is... I don't know. It doesn't feel right." Relief flooded through me. "Yeah, let's just call it an early weekend. We can always come back another time, try a different area." But as we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave, Derek stopped at the edge of the clearing. "Wait," he said. "Do you hear that?" I listened, straining my ears against the morning silence. At first, there was nothing. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound so faint it might have been my imagination. Singing. A woman's voice, wordless and haunting, drifting through the trees like mist. "We should go," I said urgently. "Now!" But Derek was already walking toward the sound, his pack forgotten at his feet. "It's beautiful," he said dreamily. "Don't you think it's beautiful?" I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back toward the trail. "Derek, we need to leave. Something's wrong here." He shook me off with surprising force. You go if you want. I need to find out where that's coming from." The singing grew louder, more complex, as if multiple voices had joined the chorus. It was beautiful, in a way that made my chest ache with longing, but underneath the melody was something else, something hungry. "Derek, please." I was begging now, all pretense of calm abandoned. "We talked about this last night. Remember what your grandfather said?" For a moment, his face cleared and I saw recognition in his eyes, fear, but then the singing swelled and his expression went slack again. "Just a quick look," he said. "I'll be right back." He disappeared into the trees before I could stop him. I stood alone in the clearing, paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to the car and drive until this nightmare was behind me. But I couldn't abandon Derek. Not my best friend. Not out here. "Derek," I shouted. "Derek, come back." My voice echoed strangely in the forest, seeming to bounce off invisible walls before fading into silence. The singing had stopped. I waited 20 minutes, then 30, calling his name until my throat was raw. Finally, I grabbed my pack and plunged into the forest after him. The trees seemed to close behind me like a living thing, cutting off my retreat. I tried to follow Derek's tracks, but the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of pine needles that showed no sign of his passage. Within minutes, I was completely lost. I stumbled through the underbrush for what felt like hours, becoming increasingly desperate as the forest grew denser and the light dimmer. My GPS was useless, showing only static, and my compass spun wildly as if I were standing on a magnetic anomaly. Then I heard him calling, "Mike! Mike! Over here!" Derek's voice coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. I crashed through the trees toward the sound, relief flooding through me. "Thank God," I panted as I stumbled into another small clearing. I was starting to think. The words died in my throat. Derek was there, standing with his back to me at the far edge of the clearing, but something was wrong. He was too still, too perfectly motionless, like a statue. And he was facing away from me, toward the deeper forest, though he'd been calling my name. "Derek?" I approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" He turned then, and I nearly screamed. It was Derek's face, Derek's body, Derek's clothes, but his eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. And his smile was too broad, stretching his lips until they were bloodless and pale. "I found her, Mike," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal except for an odd echo, as if someone else was speaking the same words a fraction of a second later. "She's beautiful. She wants to meet you." "Who?" I managed to croak. "The singer. She's been waiting for us. She's been waiting for so long." Derek's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "She's hungry, Mike. So very hungry." I backed away slowly, my hand fumbling for the bear spray on my belt. "Derek, you're scaring me. Let's just go back to camp, okay? We can talk about this there." "Camp?" Derek's laugh was like glass breaking. "There is no camp, Mike. There never was a camp. We've been walking in circles for days." That couldn't be right. Couldn't be. I'd seen the sun rise just this morning, had drunk coffee by the fire, but even as I tried to hold on to these memories, they seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. Had it been this morning? Or yesterday? How long had we been out here? "She showed me the truth," Derek continued, taking a step toward me. "Time doesn't work the same way here. Minutes stretch into hours, hours collapse into seconds. She's been calling to people for centuries, Mike, calling them home." I pulled out the bear spray with shaking hands. "Stay back, Derek. I mean it." "That won't help." His smile widened impossibly further. "I'm not Derek anymore. Derek is sleeping deep inside, dreaming of warm places and full bellies. I'm something else now, something that needs to feed." He lunged forward with inhuman speed, and I barely had time to trigger the spray. The red mist caught him full in the face, but instead of stopping him, it seemed to pass right through him like he was made of smoke. His hands, God, were those claws, raked across my chest, shredding my jacket and the skin beneath. I ran. Behind me, I could hear Derek's laughter echoing through the trees, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. There were others mixed in. Men, women, children, all laughing with the same hungry joy. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. The forest seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, trees rearranging themselves like pieces on a game board. Several times I found myself running toward what looked like an exit, only to discover it was just another wall of trees. It was as if the forest itself was alive, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I don't know how long I ran. Time had become elastic, meaningless. Sometimes the sun seemed to be overhead. Sometimes I was running through starlit darkness. Sometimes through a gray twilight that might have been dawn or dusk. My water ran out, then my food, but somehow I never felt thirsty or hungry, only tired, so incredibly tired. When I finally collapsed, it was in yet another small clearing, this one dominated by a massive dead tree whose branches reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. As I lay, gasping on the ground, I became aware that I wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of the clearing, beautiful and terrible in the half-light, tall and pale, with long dark hair that seemed to move in a wind I couldn't feel. Her dress was white, or had been once, but now it was stained with things I didn't want to identify. And her eyes. Her eyes were ancient, hungry, completely mad. "Hello, Michael," she said, and her voice was the singing I'd heard that first night, beautiful and horrible all at once. "I've been waiting for you." "What are you?" I whispered. "I have many names. The hungry one, the singer in the dark, but you can call me hunger itself." She glided closer, and I could smell her now, the scent of things long dead and rotting. "I was human once, long ago, a pioneer woman who got lost in these mountains with her children during a hard winter. We grew so hungry, Michael, so very, very hungry." I tried to crawl backward, but my body refused to respond. It was as if I was paralyzed, able only to lie there and listen to her story. When the rescue party found us in spring, I was the only one left alive. But I wasn't really alive anymore, was I? The hunger had changed me, made me into something else, something that could never be full, no matter how much it consumed. Around the clearing, other figures began to emerge from the trees. Dozens of them, all with the same two bright eyes and impossible smiles. Men in hiking gear, women in camping clothes, children in scout uniforms. All of them moving with that same predatory stillness. "They come to my forest," she continued. "Hikers, campers, hunters, looking for adventure, for escape from their mundane lives. And I give them what they seek. I show them wonders beyond imagination. I make them part of my family." Derek stepped out from behind the dead tree, but he was different now. Thinner, paler, with that same hungry gleam in his eyes. "It's not so bad, Mike," he said, and his voice was like wind through dead leaves. "The hunger hurts at first, but then you learn to love it. It becomes everything you are." "No," I managed to gasp. "No, I won't let you." The woman laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "You think you have a choice? You've been mine since the moment you entered my domain. The only question is whether you'll join willingly or if I'll have to take you piece by piece." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I remembered something Derek had said that first night. Something about his grandfather, about the old-timers who had avoided certain parts of the mountains. They'd known about her somehow, which meant there had to be a way to resist. I forced myself to focus, to think beyond the crushing presence of her hunger, the stories Derek's grandfather had told. What had they said about the ones who came back different? That they were cold, always cold, that they were hungry no matter how much they ate, but they had come back, some of them at least. "You can't keep everyone," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Some of them get away. some of them make it home." Her smile faltered for just a moment. "Those are mistakes. Weak ones who couldn't handle the gift I offered them." "Or maybe," I said, struggling to my feet despite the supernatural weight pressing down on me, "maybe you're not as powerful as you pretend to be. Maybe you can only take the ones who give up hope." The clearing erupted in angry hissing from her followers, but she held up a hand for silence. "Clever boy, but hope is a fragile thing. Let me show you what I showed your friend." The world twisted around me, reality bending like heated glass. Suddenly, I was standing in my apartment in Minneapolis, but it was wrong. The walls were covered in ice and frost clouded my breath with each exhalation. On my kitchen table sat a Thanksgiving dinner. Turkey, stuffing, all the trimmings. But when I looked closer, I saw that the meat was raw and crawling with maggots. "This is what awaits you," she whispered in my ear. "A life of endless winter, endless hunger. Wouldn't it be better to stay with me? To become something more than human?" The vision wavered, and I saw through it to the truth beneath. The clearing, the dead tree, the ring of hungry faces watching me with predatory patience. But I also saw something else. A faint path leading away from the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. "Derek," I called out, ignoring the woman's growing snarl. "Derek, I know you're still in there. Remember what your grandfather told you. Remember the stories." The thing wearing Derek's face hesitated, confusion flickering across its features. "He said some of them came back," I continued desperately. "Different, but alive. You can fight this, Derek. You can remember who you are." "Silence!" the woman shrieked, her beautiful facade cracking to reveal something monstrous underneath. "He is mine now. They are all mine." But Derek was shaking his head, his hands pressing against his temples as if he was fighting some internal battle. "Mike!" he gasped, and for a moment his voice sounded almost normal. "Mike, run. The path behind the tree. Follow it downhill. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving without you." "You have to." Derek's face contorted with pain. I can't hold her back much longer. Go." The woman let out a howl of rage that shattered the windows of reality around us. The other figures began to close in, moving with jerky, unnatural motions like marionettes. I could see now what they really were: dried husks animated by hunger, their eyes empty sockets, their smiles nothing but yellowed bone. I ran for the path Derek had indicated, the woman's screams of fury echoing behind me. The trail was treacherous, barely more than a game path winding down the mountainside, but I followed it blindly, driven by pure terror. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something like wind rushing through dead leaves, punctuated by that horrible laughter. The forest seemed to reach for me with gnarled branches, trying to trip me, to slow me down, but I kept running. The path led down and down, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Sometimes it seemed to disappear entirely, and I had to trust to instinct and momentum to carry me forward. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded, but I didn't dare slow down. Dawn was breaking when I finally stumbled out of the tree line onto a paved road. A highway patrol officer found me 3 hours later, wandering along the shoulder in a state of near collapse. I spent 2 days in the Jackson Hospital being treated for dehydration, exposure, and what the doctors called psychological trauma consistent with a wilderness survival experience. The search and rescue team found Derek's body a week later, about 2 miles from where I'd emerged from the forest. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and malnutrition, though the coroner noted several unusual factors. Derek's body showed signs of having been in the wilderness for weeks, despite the fact that we'd only been missing for 3 days. His stomach was completely empty, as if he hadn't eaten in a very long time, but there were no signs of typical starvation. Most puzzling of all, his body temperature was several degrees below normal, even accounting for the time elapsed since death. I told the authorities what I could remember, that we'd gotten lost, separated, that Derek had wandered off and I'd been unable to find him. I didn't mention the woman, or the singing, or the way time had seemed to bend and twist in that forest. Who would have believed me? But sometimes, late at night, I remember Derek's final moments of clarity, how he'd fought against whatever was controlling him long enough to save my life. The doctors say survivor's guilt is normal, that it will fade with time. They're wrong about it fading, but they're right about one thing: I am a survivor. I moved back east after that, got a job in Boston where the wilderness is safely contained in state parks and nature preserves. I don't camp anymore, don't hike alone, don't even like being outside after dark. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear her singing, calling my name with a voice like honey and poison. The woman in the woods is still out there, still hungry, still waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into her domain. And Derek is with her now, part of her family of the lost and consumed. Sometimes I wonder if any part of him remains. If somewhere in that hungry darkness my best friend is still fighting to protect others the way he protected me. I keep his picture on my desk at work, Derek grinning at the camera during our last normal weekend together, before the mountains claimed him. It's a reminder of who he was before the hunger took him, and a promise that I'll never forget the price of his sacrifice. The official records list Derek Morrison as a victim of a wilderness accident. But I know the truth. He died saving my life, giving me the chance to escape something ancient and evil that wears the face of the forest itself. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Or if I'm just another one of her puppets, sent back into the world to lure others into her web. The thought terrifies me more than any nightmare, because I can never be completely sure it isn't true. The hunger is patient, after all, and it never really goes away. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, near a place the locals call Whispering Pines Ridge, though after what I experienced there, I understand why most people refuse to speak its name aloud. I should have listened to the warnings. The trip was supposed to be my reset, a solo backpacking expedition to clear my head after the divorce. 3 days alone in the wilderness, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, my thoughts, and the kind of silence you can't find anywhere near civilization. I'd done this before, plenty of times, but never in the San Juans. Something about the remote beauty of southwestern Colorado called to me, especially after seeing photos of the area on hiking forums. The old-timer at Murphy's General Store in Pagosa Springs had given me directions to the trailhead, but his expression had soured when I mentioned Whispering Pines Ridge. "That's not a place for camping, miss," he'd said, his weathered hands gripping the counter. "Especially not alone." I'd laughed it off. Every remote wilderness area had its local legends, its cautionary tales meant to keep tourists from venturing too far off the beaten path. Besides, I was experienced. I had my GPS, my maps, my emergency beacon. What could go wrong? The drive up Forest Road 648 took longer than expected. The narrow dirt road wound through dense stands of ponderosa pine and aspen, climbing steadily toward the ridge. By the time I reached the unofficial trailhead, really just a small clearing where the road became impassable, the afternoon shadows were already growing long. I should have turned back then. Instead, I shouldered my pack and started up the trail. The path was barely visible, overgrown with mountain mahogany and scrub oak, but the solitude was exactly what I needed. No other cars at the trailhead, no boot prints in the dirt, just pristine wilderness stretching endlessly ahead. The first mile was steep but manageable. My legs burned as I gained elevation, but it felt good to push myself physically. The constant ache in my chest, the one that had been there since Derek told me he'd been seeing his secretary for 8 months, finally began to ease as I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The trees seemed to close in as I climbed higher. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was different here too, heavy, oppressive, with an undertone of something I couldn't quite identify. decay, maybe. Or something older. I'd planned to make camp around mile 3, where my topographic map showed a small clearing near a seasonal creek. But when I reached the spot, there was no clearing. Just more trees, growing so close together I could barely squeeze between them. The creek was there, but it ran black and sluggish, with an oily sheen on the surface that made my stomach turn. The GPS on my watch showed I was in the right location, but nothing matched the terrain features on my map. I double-checked the coordinates, then triple-checked them. The numbers were correct, but the landscape was wrong. I told myself it was just outdated cartography. Maps could be wrong, especially for such remote areas. I'd find another spot to camp, somewhere higher up the ridge. But as I continued climbing, the wrongness only intensified. The trees grew thicker, more tangled. The air grew colder despite the fact that I was still gaining elevation in the late afternoon. And the silence. God, the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I'd been hiking in wilderness areas for over a decade, and I'd never experienced anything like it. Nature was never truly silent. There was always something: wind in the branches, water trickling over rocks, the distant call of a hawk. But here, it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. By the time I found a suitable campsite, the sun was nearly setting. The spot was far from ideal, a small patch of relatively level ground surrounded by towering pines, but it would have to do. I was exhausted, my water was running low, and I didn't want to be setting up camp in the dark. As I worked to clear away pine needles and rocks, I noticed something odd. The trees around my campsite all had strange markings carved into their bark. Not initials or random graffiti, but symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for years. Decades, maybe. I photographed a few of them with my phone, though the screen showed no signal bars. The symbols bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. They seemed deliberate, purposeful, like warnings. Setting up my tent took longer than usual. My hands were shaking. From cold, I told myself, though the temperature wasn't that low. When I finally had camp established, I tried to start a fire. The kindling caught easily enough, but the flames kept dying out, no matter how carefully I built the structure. Even when I got a decent blaze going, the fire seemed dim, the light barely penetrating the darkness gathering between the trees. I heated up a packet of dehydrated chili for dinner, though my appetite had vanished. Every few minutes I found myself looking over my shoulder, convinced I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond my campfire's weak glow. But there was never anything there. Just more trees, fading into absolute blackness. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared. I checked the weather forecast before leaving. Lows in the mid-40s, perfectly manageable with my gear. But this felt much colder. My breath misted in the air, and frost was already forming on my tent rainfly. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the words on the page seemed to swim in the flickering firelight. The silence pressed in around me like a physical weight. I'd brought a small Bluetooth speaker, thinking I might enjoy some music under the stars. But the idea of breaking that oppressive quiet now felt somehow wrong. Dangerous even. Instead, I crawled into my tent early and tried to sleep. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A soft susurrus through the pine needles, barely audible. But as I lay there listening, the sounds began to take on a different quality. Rhythmic, almost like speech, but in a language I couldn't understand. I unzipped my tent vestibule and peered out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting everything in a hellish red glow. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around me, from the darkness between the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I lay awake for hours, straining my ears but heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke to find my campfire burning brightly. That should have been impossible. I hadn't added wood to it since before going to bed, and there had been nothing but embers when I'd looked out during the night. Yet now, just before dawn, the fire blazed as if it had been freshly built. My stomach clenched with fear as I examined the fire more closely. The wood wasn't from the deadfall I'd gathered. These were fresh-cut logs, still green in places, arranged in a perfect teepee structure. Someone, or something, had rebuilt my fire while I slept. I broke camp as quickly as possible, my hands trembling as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its compression sack. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a threat. Every creak of the wind-stressed pine sounded like footsteps. The trail out should have been simple. Just retrace my steps from the previous day. But as I started down the mountain, nothing looked familiar. The path branched in places I didn't remember, leading off in directions that made no sense according to my compass. My GPS watch showed my location as a point floating in empty white space, as if I'd somehow wandered off the edge of the mapped world. I told myself not to panic. I was an experienced hiker. I had enough food and water for 3 days, and I'd left my planned route with the Forest Service. If I didn't check in as scheduled, search and rescue would come looking for me. But as the hours passed, the wrongness only intensified. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves to block paths that had been clear moments before. The whispers started again, following me as I hiked, always just at the edge of hearing. By midday, I was completely lost. I stopped for lunch in a small clearing, spreading my map on a fallen log and trying to make sense of my location. According to my compass, I'd been heading consistently downhill, which should have taken me back toward the trailhead. But the terrain features didn't match anything on my topographic map. It was as if I'd somehow wandered into a completely different forest. That's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her dark hair hanging in tangled braids. Her feet were bare, which made no sense given the cold temperature and rough terrain. "Hi there," I called out, relief flooding through me. If there was a child here, there had to be adults nearby. A family camping, maybe, or local residents who could point me toward the nearest road. The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, dark eyes. There was something unsettling about her gaze. Too intense, too knowing for someone her age. "Are you lost, honey?" I asked, standing slowly so I wouldn't frighten her. "Where are your parents?" She raised one pale hand and pointed deeper into the forest, in the direction I'd been heading. Then she smiled. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen. Her teeth were wrong, too sharp, too numerous, crowding her small mouth like broken glass. And her eyes were completely black, with no visible whites or pupils, just endless, empty darkness. I stumbled backward, my pack sliding off my shoulders to hit the ground with a thud. When I looked up again, she was gone. I told myself it was altitude sickness, dehydration, stress from the divorce. Anything but the truth that was clawing at the edges of my consciousness, that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, something that defied rational explanation. I grabbed my pack and started moving again, no longer caring about following any particular path. I just needed to get away from that clearing, away from the memory of that impossible smile. But she was waiting for me at the next bend in the trail. This time she was sitting on a boulder, swinging her legs like any normal child might. Except her legs bent the wrong way at the knees, and her neck was twisted at an angle that should have been fatal. "Lost?" she asked, her voice carrying despite the fact that her mouth didn't move. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and pack, pine needles showering down around me. Behind me, I could hear her laughing, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the cry of a dying animal. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed elastic in that cursed forest, stretching and compressing without pattern or logic. The sun should have been moving across the sky, but it remained frozen at the same position, casting identical shadows no matter how far I traveled. When I finally stopped, gasping and exhausted, I was standing in my campsite from the night before. That was impossible. I'd been hiking downhill for hours, putting miles between myself and the ridge. There was no way I could have circled back to the same spot. But there was my tent, exactly as I'd left it, the cold ashes of my campfire. Even the pine needles I'd cleared away were still arranged in the same pattern, and there were new symbols carved into the trees. These were fresh, the bark still weeping sap where something sharp had cut into the wood. They formed a rough circle around my campsite, each symbol more complex and disturbing than the last. Looking at them made my eyes water and my head throb, as if my brain was rejecting the information they contained. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't lost in any ordinary sense. I was trapped. The child appeared again as the sun began to set, or pretend to set, since I was no longer convinced that day and night had any real meaning in this place. She sat cross-legged in the exact center of my campsite, her broken form flickering like a flame in a strong wind. "Why won't you let me leave?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She tilted her head, too far in a way that made my spine crawl. "Leave?" The word came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees. "But you asked to come here." "I never." "You wished for silence," she continued, her black eyes boring into mine. "For emptiness, for an end to the voices in your head. I heard you, Sarah Rodriguez. I heard you calling to me." And with a sick jolt of recognition, I remembered. 3 months ago, during the worst of the divorce proceedings, sitting in my lawyer's office while Derek's attorney listed every reason why I deserved nothing. I'd pressed my palms against my ears, desperate to block out their voices, and I'd whispered a prayer to anyone who might be listening. "Please, just make it stop. I'd give anything for some peace and quiet." "You're not a child," I said. Her form rippled, shifting like smoke. For a moment I saw what she really was, something ancient and hungry, with too many limbs and a mouth that split its face nearly in half. Then she was a little girl again, innocent and smiling. "I'm whatever you need me to be," she said, "but you called me, and now you're mine, just like the others who came before you." "Others?" She gestured toward the trees, and suddenly I could see them. Dozens of human shapes pressed into the bark, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and despair. Hikers and campers who'd wandered into her domain, who'd made the same mistake I had. "The silence is perfect here," she said. "No more angry words, no more painful truths, no more voices telling you that you're not good enough, not pretty enough, not worth fighting for. Just peace. Forever." I could feel her pull, the seductive promise of an end to all the hurt and confusion that had driven me to this place. Part of me wanted to give in, to let the emptiness swallow me whole. It would be so much easier than going back to face the wreckage of my life. But another part of me, the part that had always been stubborn, that had fought tooth and nail for everything I'd ever achieved, rebelled against the idea of surrender. "No," I said. Her smile faltered. "No?" "I didn't come here to give up," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I came here to figure out how to start over, and I can't do that if I'm dead." The thing wearing the little girl's face snarled, its features shifting and melting. "You called me." I was hurt and angry, but I'm not anymore. It was true, I realized. The constant ache in my chest was gone, replaced by something harder and more resolute. My marriage is over. My old life is over. But that doesn't mean I'm over. The creature lunged at me, its form expanding into something with claws and teeth and too many joints. I rolled aside, grabbing my hiking poles from where they leaned against a tree. Iron, my grandmother had always said. Iron was protection against the old things. I struck out wildly as the thing circled me, its shape constantly shifting between child and monster. My poles passed through it sometimes, meeting no resistance, but other times they connected with something solid that shrieked and recoiled. The symbols carved into the trees began to glow with a sickly green light. The human faces trapped in the bark turned to watch our struggle, their mouths moving soundlessly. Whether they were cheering for me or warning me away, I couldn't tell. The creature charged again, and this time I didn't dodge. I met it head-on, driving both poles deep into what might have been its chest. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and suddenly the forest around us began to fragment like a broken mirror. I saw flashes of the real world through the cracks, the actual trail, overgrown but navigable, my car waiting at the trailhead just half a mile away, the sun setting over genuine mountains instead of this twisted prison. "This isn't over," the creature hissed as its form began to dissolve. "You opened the door. I'll always be able to find you now." "Then I'll be ready," I said. The last thing I saw before the false forest shattered completely was the little girl's face. Not the monster's disguise, but the real child, pale and frightened and so very young. She'd been the first victim, I realized, trapped here so long ago that she'd become part of the prison itself. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then I was standing on a normal hiking trail in a normal forest, with normal shadows and normal sounds. Birds calling, wind in the trees, the distant hum of traffic from the highway below. My car was visible through the trees, exactly where I'd left it. I hiked out as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I reached the parking area. Only then did I turn back to look at the trailhead sign, the one I'd somehow missed on my way in. It read, "Whispering Pines Ridge Trail. Closed due to multiple disappearances. Enter at your own risk." The letters were weathered and faded, as if the sign had been there for years. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in Pagosa Springs and told them everything, or at least a version of everything that didn't involve supernatural creatures and trapped souls. A story about getting lost, finding strange symbols carved into trees, experiencing what might have been altitude sickness or dehydration. I gave them the GPS coordinates from my watch, the photos I'd taken of the symbols. The deputy who took my statement was polite but clearly skeptical. "They'd had reports before," he said. "Hikers claiming to see things in that area, getting turned around despite clear weather and good visibility. Most of them eventually found their way out, like I had." "Most of them?" I asked. He showed me a file folder thick with missing person reports. Dozens of them, dating back over 50 years. All experienced hikers who'd vanished without a trace in the Whispering Pines area. "We search every time," he said. "Never find anything, not even remains." I left town that afternoon and drove straight through to Denver, stopping only for gas and coffee. I checked into a hotel near the airport and caught the first flight back to Phoenix the next morning. That was 6 months ago. The thing, whatever it was, kept its promise. It found me. It started small, shadows moving wrong in my peripheral vision, whispers in empty rooms, the faint sound of a little girl singing nursery rhymes when I was alone in my apartment. Then it escalated. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, and when I answered, I'd hear my own voice on the other end, pleading for help from somewhere far away. Photos on my social media would change on their own, showing me in places I'd never been, standing next to people I didn't recognize, people who all had the same black eyes. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just stress and PTSD from the experience. But the manifestations grew stronger, more persistent. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. I'd wake up to find fresh pine needles scattered across my bedroom floor, arranged in those same symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. 2 weeks ago, I started seeing her again. The little girl, standing at the end of my street, sitting in my car when I came out of work, reflected in my bathroom mirror when I brushed my teeth, always smiling that terrible smile, always watching. Last night, I found a note on my pillow written in my own handwriting. "The door is still open. Come back and finish what you started." I know what I have to do now. The creature was right. I opened something that day in the forest, created a connection that won't close on its own. The only way to end this is to go back and finish what I started. Not to surrender to it, but to fight it properly this time. To find a way to close the door and free the souls it's trapped. I've done my research. I know what the symbols mean now. They're bindings, designed to hold something in place. But bindings can be broken if you know how. I'm driving back to Colorado tomorrow. I've got iron weapons this time, blessed by 3 different priests. I've got salt and sage and silver bells. I've got a plan, and more importantly, I've got something I didn't have before. A reason to live. Derek can have the house, the car, the bank accounts. I don't need those things anymore. I need to know that I'm strong enough to face the darkness without being consumed by it. I need to save that little girl, and all the others. I need to prove to myself that I'm not a victim. Not of Derek's betrayal, not of my own despair, and not of whatever hungry thing lives in those mountains. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. Don't come looking for me. Don't trust any stories you hear about someone named Sarah Rodriguez being found safe. If I don't make it back, burn this journal and forget you ever heard of Whispering Pines Ridge. But if I do make it back, if I manage to close the door and free those trapped souls, then maybe there's hope for anyone who's ever felt lost in their own darkness. Maybe we can all find our way home. I can hear her singing again, somewhere in the distance. Time to go. This time, I'm ready. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the San Juan National Forest in southwestern Colorado, near the abandoned mining town of Platoro, where the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight and cell towers are nothing but a distant memory. I should have listened to my gut. I should have turned around the moment I saw how Trevor's eyes kept darting to the tree line, like he was expecting something to emerge from the shadows between the aspens. But I didn't. None of us did. We were too caught up in the excitement of escaping our suffocating cubicles at Morrison & Associates accounting firm. Too eager to prove we weren't just another group of soft office workers who couldn't handle a few nights in the wilderness. The plan had been simple enough. 5 days in the San Juan backcountry, hiking the remote trails near Conejos Peak, where the altitude hits you like a sledgehammer and the nearest road is 15 miles of broken terrain away. It was supposed to be a bonding experience for our team. Me, Trevor Kowalski, Sarah Chen, and Marcus Rivera. Our boss, Janet, had even encouraged it, saying we needed to build trust and communication outside the office environment. If only she knew what kind of trust we'd end up testing. Trevor was the one who'd suggested this particular location. He'd grown up in nearby Antonito and claimed to know these mountains like the back of his hand. My grandfather used to hunt these trails, he'd said, spreading out a topographical map in the break room. There's places up there most people never see. Real wilderness, not some sanitized campground experience. Sarah had been hesitant at first. She was the cautious one among us, always double-checking calculations and backing up files. But Marcus and I had convinced her. "Come on, Sarah," Marcus had laughed. "What's the worst that could happen? We get a little dirt under our fingernails?" Now, 3 days into our trip, I was learning exactly what the worst could be. It started with the smell. Not the clean pine scent you'd expect at 11,000 feet elevation, but something else underneath it. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. I first noticed it on our second night when I'd gotten up to relieve myself around 2 a.m. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the darkness beyond our camp felt alive, pressing in on all sides with an almost physical weight. I've always hated the dark. It's embarrassing to admit as a grown man, but there it is. As a kid, I'd sleep with every light in the house on if my parents would let me. The darkness felt hungry to me, like it was waiting for something. Up here in the mountains, that childhood fear came flooding back with compound interest. I'd finished my business quickly and hurried back to the fire, adding more wood to push back the shadows. That's when I saw Trevor sitting up in his sleeping bag, staring out into the forest. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. "Couldn't sleep either?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. Trevor turned toward me slowly, and his face looked different somehow. Sharper. His usually warm smile was gone, replaced by something that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The forest is loud tonight," he said. His voice sounded hoarse, like he'd been shouting. I listened, but all I could hear was the usual nighttime chorus. Wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, maybe a branch falling somewhere in the darkness. "Sounds normal to me," I said. Trevor's head tilted to one side, and I swear I heard his neck crack. "Listen closer, Mike. Really listen." So I did, and that's when I heard it. Underneath the natural sounds, something else. A rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood, or claws on bark. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, creating a pattern that made my skin crawl. "What is that?" I asked, but when I looked back at Trevor, he was already lying down, his breathing deep and even like he'd fallen instantly asleep. I spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the sounds. By morning, with Sarah frying bacon and Marcus boiling coffee over our camp stove, it all seemed like a bad dream. Trevor was his usual cheerful self, joking about Sarah's cooking and helping Marcus plan our route for the day. "We're going to hit Spectacle Lake today," Trevor announced, pointing to a spot on his weathered map. "It's about 6 miles northeast, up through Devil's Canyon. Beautiful spot, crystal clear water, surrounded by peaks. My grandfather used to say the fishing there was so good it was almost supernatural." Sarah frowned at the map. "That's not on my GPS. Are you sure about the location?" Trevor laughed. "GPS is useless up here, Sarah. Too many mountains blocking the satellites. Trust me, I know where we're going." And that was the beginning of the end. The hike to Devil's Canyon started normally enough. The trail was clear, marked with occasional blazes on the trees. But as we climbed higher, the blazes became less frequent, and the trail began to fade into game paths and deer tracks that branched in confusing directions. "Are you sure this is right?" Marcus asked around noon, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was struggling with the altitude, breathing hard after each steep section. "Positive," Trevor said, but I noticed he'd stopped consulting his map. He seemed to be navigating by instinct now, leading us deeper into trackless forest where the aspens gave way to dark stands of spruce and fir. The smell was getting stronger too, that sweet, cloying odor that seemed to follow us like an invisible cloud. Sarah noticed it too. "God, what is that stench?" she said, covering her nose with her shirt. "Smells like something died up here." "Probably just a dead elk," Trevor said without turning around. "Bears or mountain lions drag their kills into the deep forest sometimes." But I was watching Trevor's face when he said it, and I saw something there that made my stomach twist. He was smiling, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, too knowing, like he was enjoying a private joke that none of us were in on. The forest around us was changing too. The trees seemed older here, their trunks massive and scarred with deep gouges that I told myself were made by bear claws, though they seemed too regular, too intentional. The underbrush was different as well, thick and thorny with plants I didn't recognize. Some of them had leaves that looked almost flesh-colored, with veins that pulsed in the wind like arteries. We stopped for lunch in a small clearing where a stream trickled over moss-covered rocks. The water looked clean, but when Marcus bent down to fill his bottle, Trevor grabbed his wrist. "I wouldn't drink from that," Trevor said. His grip looked painful, and Marcus winced. "Why not? Looks fine to me. Just trust me." Trevor's voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. "Use the water we brought." Marcus pulled his hand away, looking confused and a little hurt. "Okay, man. Chill." But I was looking at the stream more closely now, and I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The rocks under the water weren't rocks at all. They were bones. Skulls, mostly, with empty eye sockets staring up at us through the clear water. Deer skulls, I told myself. Or elk. But some of them looked too round, too large for animal skulls. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat like chunks of ice. After lunch, Trevor announced that we were close to Spectacle Lake. "Just over that ridge," he said, pointing to a steep slope covered in deadfall and thick undergrowth. "Maybe another hour of hiking." But we'd been hiking for another 3 hours when Sarah finally called a halt. "Trevor, I think we're lost. We should have reached this lake by now." The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. Soon it would be dark, and the thought of spending another night in this place made my hands shake. "We're not lost," Trevor insisted. "I know exactly where we are." "Then where's the lake?" Marcus demanded. He was getting irritated, his face flushed from exertion and altitude. Trevor's expression went cold. "It's right up ahead. 5 more minutes." But 5 minutes turned into 10, then 20. The forest around us was growing darker and stranger. The trees here were wrong somehow, twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. Some of them looked almost human, frozen in positions of agony or supplication. And the smell. God, the smell was overwhelming now. Not just rot, but something else underneath it. Something that reminded me of the morgue, where I'd had to identify my father's body after his car accident. The smell of death and formaldehyde and things that should stay buried. "Okay, that's it," Sarah said, dropping her pack. "I'm not going any further. We need to set up camp and figure out where we are in the morning." "No," Trevor said sharply. "We keep going. We're almost there." "Trevor, look around," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The sun's going down. We need to find a good spot to camp, somewhere defensible." "Defensible?" Trevor's head snapped toward me. "Defensible against what, Mike?" The way he said it made my blood freeze, like he knew something we didn't, like he was expecting something to come for us in the dark. Marcus started gathering deadwood for a fire, but the branches he collected seemed damp and rotten, despite the dry weather we'd been having. When he tried to light them, they produced more smoke than flame, and the smoke was the wrong color, greenish-black and acrid like burning plastic. "What kind of wood is this?" Marcus coughed, waving the smoke away from his face. "Local variety," Trevor said. He was standing at the edge of our small clearing, staring out into the darkening forest. "Burns different up here." The fire finally caught, though it gave off that sickly green glow and produced almost no heat. We arranged our sleeping bags around it and tried to eat dinner, but the food tasted wrong. The dried fruit was bitter, the jerky was slimy, and the trail mix smelled like it had been soaked in bleach. "Did anyone else's food go bad?" Sarah asked, poking at her meal with obvious disgust. "Mine's fine," Trevor said, though I noticed he wasn't actually eating anything. By full dark, we were all on edge. The sounds in the forest had changed from the natural nighttime chorus to something else entirely. There was still that rhythmic tapping I'd heard the night before, but now it was accompanied by other noises. Scratching sounds, like claws on rock. Wet, sliding noises that I didn't want to think about. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I'm going to gather more firewood," Trevor announced suddenly, standing up. "It's pitch black out there," Sarah protested. "Wait until morning." "Won't take long," Trevor said. He was already walking toward the tree line, and I noticed he wasn't carrying a flashlight. "Trevor, wait," I called, but he was gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. We sat in tense silence for maybe 20 minutes, listening to the weird sounds in the forest and watching the green flames flicker and dance. The fire seemed to be getting dimmer, despite all the wood we'd fed it. "Should we go look for him?" Marcus asked. "No," Sarah said firmly. "Rule number 1 in the wilderness. If someone gets separated, you stay put. He knows where the camp is." But I was worried. Trevor had been acting strange all day, and now he'd wandered off into God knows what in the middle of the night. What if he was hurt? What if he'd fallen into a ravine or gotten turned around in the dark? Then we heard him coming back. His footsteps were loud, crackling through the underbrush like he wasn't bothering to watch where he stepped. But something about the rhythm was off. Instead of the usual left-right pattern of walking, it sounded more like left-left-right, left-left-right, like he was dragging one foot. "Trevor," Sarah called, "you okay?" No answer, but the footsteps kept coming, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but all I could see were the dark trunks of trees and the thick undergrowth moving in the beam. Then he stepped into the circle of firelight, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Trevor, but wrong. Everything about him was just slightly off, like a photograph that had been developed incorrectly. His clothes were the same, his face was the same, but the proportions were subtly different. His arms seemed too long, hanging past his knees. His smile was too wide, stretching almost to his ears. And his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like someone had filled the sockets with tar. "Found some good wood," he said, and his voice was wrong too. Still recognizably Trevor's voice, but pitched slightly lower, with an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere behind him rather than from his throat. He was carrying an armload of branches, but they weren't normal branches. They were pale and smooth, like bone, and they had a weird organic quality that made my stomach lurch. They looked almost like arm bones. Human arm bones. "Trevor," I said carefully, "are you feeling all right?" His head turned toward me with a motion that was too fluid, too quick. "Never better, Mike. Never better." He dropped the bone branches onto our fire, and they caught immediately, burning with an intense blue flame that cast dancing shadows across his face. In that light, I could see that Trevor's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface, spreading out from his temples like spider webs. When he smiled, I caught a glimpse of his teeth, and they were different too, longer, sharper, filed to points. Sarah and Marcus had noticed it too. I could see them inching away from Trevor, their faces pale with growing horror. "Where did you find that wood?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, it was just lying around," Trevor said. "Lots of good material in these woods. You just have to know where to look." He sat down across from us, folding his two long legs under him in a position that would have been impossible for a normal human. "Beautiful night, isn't it? Perfect for a story." None of us responded. We were all staring at him, trying to process what we were seeing. This thing that looked like Trevor but wasn't Trevor. This thing that had come back from the dark wearing our friend's face. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about these mountains," Trevor continued, his black eyes reflecting the blue firelight. "About the old things that live in the deep places, the things that came before the Indians, before the Europeans, before anything human walked this earth. He said they were still here, waiting in the dark corners and forgotten valleys, just waiting for the right kind of bait to draw them out." "What kind of bait?" Marcus asked, though his voice was shaking. Trevor's smile stretched even wider, and I heard a wet, tearing sound as the corners of his mouth split to accommodate the expression. "Oh, you know, warm blood, fresh meat, trusting friends who follow you into the woods without asking too many questions." That's when we ran. I don't remember who moved first, but suddenly we were all scrambling to our feet, grabbing what we could carry and plunging into the forest. Behind us, I could hear Trevor laughing, or the thing that looked like Trevor. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with the howl of wind through a cave. We crashed through the underbrush in blind panic, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, roots catching our feet and sending us stumbling. I had my flashlight, but the beam seemed weaker here, barely penetrating more than a few feet into the darkness. "Which way?" Sarah gasped. "Which way is out?" But none of us knew. We'd followed Trevor so far off the marked trails that we might as well have been on another planet. Every direction looked the same, dark trees and thick undergrowth and shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. We kept running until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen log that provided some cover. We huddled there in the dark, listening for sounds of pursuit, but the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no wind, no rustling of small animals. Just an oppressive, waiting silence that was somehow worse than any amount of noise. "What the hell was that thing?" Marcus whispered. "I don't know," I said, though I was starting to have an idea. Growing up in Colorado, you hear stories, old stories, passed down from the Native American tribes who lived here long before the miners and ranchers arrived. Stories about shapeshifters and skinwalkers, about things that could wear a human face while harboring something utterly inhuman underneath. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said. "We need to find the trail and get back to civilization." "Which way?" I asked. None of us had an answer to that. In our panic, we'd run blindly, with no sense of direction. The canopy was too thick to see the stars, and our compass was back at the camp with the rest of our gear. That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the distance, moving through the forest with that same odd rhythm. Left, left, right, left, left, right. And accompanying the footsteps, a sound I'd never heard before but recognized on some primal level. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and rocks until it surrounded us completely. "It's hunting us," Marcus whispered. The footsteps were getting closer, and with them came that smell again. That sweet, rotten odor that now seemed to carry undertones of sulfur and burnt meat. I could taste it in the back of my throat, like licking a battery terminal. We started moving again, trying to stay quiet, trying to put distance between us and whatever was following. But every direction we turned, the footsteps seemed to anticipate us, cutting off our escape routes, herding us deeper into the forest like sheep being driven to slaughter. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed fluid here, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. At one point, I looked at my watch and saw that the hands were spinning wildly, the digital display flickering through random numbers like a slot machine. We came to a clearing where ancient stone foundations poked up through the forest floor, remnants of some long-abandoned structure, probably a mining camp from the 1800s, but the stones were carved with symbols that definitely weren't European. Spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they were trying to push their way into my brain through my optic nerve. "We should rest here," Sarah said. She was exhausted, stumbling with every step. "No," I said. "Something's wrong with this place. Can't you feel it?" And there was something wrong. The air itself felt thick here, viscous, like trying to breathe underwater. The symbols on the stones seemed to be moving when I wasn't looking directly at them, writhing and shifting like living things. But Sarah had already collapsed against one of the foundation stones, and Marcus was sitting heavily on another. I wanted to drag them away from this place, but I was exhausted too, my legs shaking from hours of flight through the dark forest. That's when Trevor found us. He stepped into the clearing like he'd been expecting us to be there, like he'd known all along where we were heading. But he looked even worse now. His skin had taken on a mottled, diseased appearance, and pieces of him seemed to be missing, chunks of flesh that revealed something dark and writhing underneath. His clothes were torn and bloody, and I could see bones poking through the gaps where they shouldn't be. "There you are," he said, and his voice was like gravel in a blender. "I was starting to worry you'd gotten lost." Sarah screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that echoed off the stones and seemed to wake something in the forest around us. I heard answering calls from the darkness, howls and shrieks that definitely didn't come from any animal I knew. "Now, Sarah," Trevor said, taking a step toward us. "That's not very polite. After all, we're still friends, aren't we?" Marcus grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at Trevor's head with all his strength. The branch connected with a wet, meaty sound, but instead of falling down, Trevor just turned his head to look at Marcus with mild interest. The side of his skull was caved in, and something dark was leaking out, but he didn't seem bothered by it. "That wasn't very nice, Marcus," Trevor said. Then he reached out with one hand and grabbed Marcus by the throat. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Trevor lifted Marcus off the ground with one hand, his fingers elongating into claws that punctured the skin of Marcus's neck. Marcus thrashed and gurgled, blood streaming down his chest, but Trevor held him effortlessly. "I'm still hungry," Trevor said conversationally. All that walking worked up quite an appetite. Then he opened his mouth and it kept opening, unhinging like a snake's jaw until it was big enough to accommodate a human head. Inside, instead of teeth and tongue, there was just darkness. Not empty darkness, but active darkness, like looking into a hole that led straight to hell. Marcus's screams cut off abruptly as Trevor bit down. I heard the wet crunch of bone, saw blood spray across the ancient stones, and then Marcus went limp. Trevor dropped the body and turned toward Sarah and me. His face was covered in blood, and chunks of flesh hung from his distended jaw. When he smiled, bits of Marcus fell out of his mouth and landed on the ground with soft, wet sounds. "Your turn," he said. That's when Sarah did something incredible. Instead of running or screaming, she grabbed one of the stones from the foundation and hurled it at Trevor with deadly accuracy. The stone struck him in the center of his chest, and instead of bouncing off, it seemed to sink into him like he was made of mud. Trevor staggered backward, looking down at the stone protruding from his chest with what might have been surprise. Black ichor leaked out around the edges, and for the first time since he'd returned from the woods, he looked uncertain. "The stones," Sarah gasped. "The symbols. They're some kind of ward. Protection against—" Trevor let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal and lunged toward us. I grabbed another stone and threw it, catching him in the shoulder. This one had the same effect, sinking into his flesh and causing him to stumble. But there were only so many stones, and Trevor was adapting, learning to dodge our throws. Worse, I could hear more sounds coming from the forest around us. More footsteps, more howls, more of whatever Trevor had become. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Which way?" Sarah asked. I looked around the clearing, trying to think. Then I noticed something. A subtle difference in the darkness between the trees on one side of the clearing. It was lighter there, just barely, as if there might be open sky beyond the canopy. "That way," I said, pointing. We ran again, leaving Marcus's body behind in that cursed clearing. I tried not to think about what would happen to him, what would be left when the sun came up. If the sun came up. The lighter area turned out to be a ridgeline, and when we reached it, I could see the glow of distant lights far below. Civilization, safety, the town of Antonito maybe, or at least a road that could take us there. But Trevor was behind us, crashing through the forest with inhuman speed. And he wasn't alone anymore. I could see other shapes moving between the trees, things that might once have been human but were now something else entirely. An entire pack of them hunting us like wolves. The slope down from the ridge was steep and treacherous, covered in loose scree that shifted under our feet. Sarah lost her footing and tumbled, rolling down the hillside in a cloud of dust and loose rock. I scrambled after her, half falling, half sliding, stones cutting through my clothes and skin. Behind us, Trevor and his pack had reached the ridge. They started down after us, but something was different now. They moved more cautiously, like the slope was somehow dangerous to them. Maybe the symbols on those foundation stones had weakened them, or maybe something about this particular hillside offered protection. Sarah had landed hard at the bottom, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. When I reached her, she was conscious but pale with pain. "I think it's broken," she whispered. I looked back up the slope. Trevor and the others had stopped about halfway down, just standing there in the darkness, watching us. Their eyes reflected what little light there was, glowing like coal embers. "Can you walk?" I asked Sarah. "I don't think so." I made a decision that still keeps me awake at night. I left her there. I picked up the biggest rock I could carry and started walking back up the slope toward Trevor and his pack. "You want me?" I shouted. "Come and get me." Trevor tilted his head, studying me with those black, empty eyes. "Oh, Mike," he said, and for just a moment his voice sounded almost like the old Trevor again. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Then why don't you come down here and show me?" But he didn't. None of them did. They just stood there on the slope, held back by something I couldn't see or understand. Some invisible barrier that they couldn't or wouldn't cross. We stayed that way for what felt like hours. Me standing defiantly at the bottom of the slope, them watching from their position halfway up. The sky began to lighten in the east, and as the first rays of sun touched the ridgeline, they started to fade. Not disappearing exactly, but becoming translucent, like ghosts in the growing light. Trevor was the last to go. As the sun crested the mountains and true daylight flooded the valley, he looked down at me one final time. "This isn't over, Mike," he said. "We know where you live. We know where you work. We'll find you again." Then he was gone, and I was alone on the hillside with Sarah and the morning light and the terrible knowledge of what we'd seen. The rest is a blur. Sarah's screams as I helped her down to the road. The confused park rangers who found us wandering along Highway 160, babbling about monsters in the woods. The search parties that went looking for Trevor and Marcus and never found so much as a scrap of clothing or a drop of blood. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead. Exposure, probably, or a fall into one of the deep ravines that crisscross those mountains. The investigators were sympathetic but skeptical when Sarah and I tried to tell them what really happened. Altitude sickness can cause hallucinations, they said. Stress and exhaustion can make people see things that aren't there. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere in the deep forests of the San Juan Mountains, in the places where the old maps have blank spaces and the GPS satellites can't reach, there are things that wear human faces while harboring something utterly inhuman underneath. Sarah moved to Florida after her leg healed. Said she needed to get as far away from mountains as possible. We don't talk anymore, not since the nightmares started getting worse for both of us. Not since we both began to notice things moving in the shadows at the edge of our vision, things that might be following us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I still work at Morrison & Associates, though I've requested a transfer to the Miami office. Janet approved it without question. She said the trauma of losing 2 team members was clearly affecting my performance. She's right about that. I can barely concentrate anymore, especially after dark. Every shadow seems to hide something with black eyes and too many teeth. Every unexpected sound makes me jump and reach for a weapon. The worst part is the doubt. The tiny voice in the back of my mind that whispers, maybe the park rangers were right. Maybe it was just altitude sickness and exhaustion, and the stress of being lost in unfamiliar terrain. Maybe Trevor and Marcus really did just fall into a ravine, and everything else was just my mind trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. But then I remember the smell, that sweet, rotten odor that I can still taste sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night. I remember the sounds those bone branches made when they burned, and the way Trevor's mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open. And I remember his last words. "We know where you live." So I don't sleep much anymore. I keep all the lights on in my apartment, and I've installed deadbolts on every door and window. I've learned to shoot a gun, though I doubt bullets would do much good against something that could absorb stone projectiles into its flesh without flinching. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I hear that rhythmic tapping again. Left, left, right, left, left, right. Footsteps on the fire escape outside my window or in the hallway outside my door. When I look, there's never anything there, but I know they're watching, waiting. Trevor was right about one thing. This isn't over. And someday, when I let my guard down or make the mistake of venturing too far from the safety of crowds and bright lights, they'll find me again. I just hope that when they do, they make it quick, but I don't think they will.